Long before the rise of the Imperium, before the Great Crusade stretched humanity's dominion across the galaxy, and millennia before the Emperor's golden throne cast its psychic beacon through the warp, Terra was a primitive world shrouded in superstition and darkness. During these ancient epochs, when humanity had barely learned to harness fire and forge crude tools from stone and bronze, a select few individuals possessed abilities that set them apart from their tribal kin. These were the Shamans, humanity's first psychers, blessed and cursed with the power to perceive and manipulate the roiling energies of the Imperium. The Shamans emerged during humanity's earliest development, when the species was still confined to scattered tribes across Terra's continents. Unlike the wild, uncontrolled psychers that would plague later ages, these ancient practitioners possessed a deep understanding of their abilities and the realm from which their power flowed. They served as intermediaries between the material world and the warp, guiding their people through the treacherous spiritual landscape that existed parallel to physical reality. Their knowledge encompassed not merely the manipulation of psychic energy, but also the fundamental nature of souls, death, and rebirth. These early psychers functioned as humanity's spiritual guardians, protecting primitive communities from the predations of warp entities that sought to exploit the growing psychic presence of the human race. They understood that consciousness and emotion fed the Imperium, and that strong feelings, particularly those of fear, anger, and despair, could tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Through careful meditation, ritual practice, and accumulated wisdom passed down through generations, the Shamans learned to navigate the warp's currents and shield their people from its more malevolent inhabitants. The Shamans possessed a unique ability that distinguished them from ordinary humans. Upon death, their souls retained enough coherence and strength to successfully navigate the warp and return to the material realm through reincarnation. This process was neither simple nor guaranteed, requiring tremendous willpower and spiritual discipline. The soul of a deceased shaman would traverse the chaotic currents of the Imperium, avoiding the countless predators and malevolent entities that sought to devour or corrupt it, before finding a suitable vessel for rebirth. Through this cycle of death and renewal, the Shamans accumulated knowledge and power across multiple lifetimes, becoming increasingly skilled in their understanding of both the material and immaterial realms. This reincarnation process served a crucial function in humanity's early development. The Shamans acted as repositories of knowledge, preserving crucial information about survival, spiritual practices, and the nature of the warp across generations. They guided their tribes through natural disasters, protected them from demonic incursions, and helped establish the early foundations of human civilization. Their accumulated wisdom, spanning multiple lifetimes, made them invaluable leaders and advisors to the primitive communities they served. However, as humanity spread across Terra and their populations grew, the nature of the warp itself began to change. The Imperium, once a relatively calm realm of pure thought and emotion, gradually became more turbulent and dangerous. The collective psychic emanations of billions of human minds, filled with increasingly complex emotions and darker impulses, began to coalesce into malevolent entities within the warp. These nascent chaos powers fed on humanity's negative emotions, growing stronger with each act of violence, betrayal, and cruelty committed by the expanding human race. The corruption of the Imperium proceeded slowly over millennia, but its effects became increasingly apparent to the Shamans who regularly traversed its currents. Where once they had encountered relatively benign warp entities or empty psychic space, they now faced increasingly aggressive and cunning predators. The journey between death and rebirth became more perilous with each passing generation, as malevolent forces actively hunted the souls of the Shamans, seeking to corrupt or destroy them before they could complete their cycle of reincarnation. As the warp grew more dangerous, the Shamans found their numbers dwindling. Many souls that had successfully navigated the reincarnation process for countless lifetimes were finally overwhelmed by the growing tide of chaos. Others became corrupted during their journey, returning to the material realm as twisted shadows of their former selves, possessed by demonic entities or driven mad by exposure to the warp's increasingly toxic emanations. The loss of each shaman represented not only the death of an individual, but the permanent loss of millennia of accumulated knowledge and wisdom. The surviving shamans recognized that their traditional methods of protecting humanity were becoming insufficient. The very growth and development of human civilization was feeding the corruption of the warp, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where humanity's expansion made their spiritual guardians less capable of protecting them. The shamans understood that without intervention, the increasing corruption of the Imperium would eventually make reincarnation impossible, leaving humanity defenseless against the growing threat of chaos. Faced with this existential crisis, the remaining shamans gathered in secret conclave to discuss their options. These meetings, held in hidden locations across Terra, brought together the most powerful and experienced psykers of their age. They shared their observations of the warp's corruption and debated potential solutions to the growing threat. Some advocated for attempting to purge the Imperium of its malevolent influences, while others suggested withdrawing from psychic practice entirely to starve the chaos powers of their sustenance. After extensive deliberation, the shamans reached a radical conclusion. They determined that the only way to protect humanity from the growing threat of chaos was to sacrifice their individual existence to create a single, supremely powerful consciousness that could serve as humanity's eternal guardian. This entity would possess the combined knowledge, power, and spiritual strength of all the shamans, making it capable of withstanding the corruption of the warp and protecting humanity for millennia to come. The plan required the voluntary death of thousands of shamans in a single, coordinated ritual. Each participant would need to surrender their individual identity and merge their soul with the collective consciousness being created. Unlike their normal reincarnation process, which preserved individual identity across lifetimes, this great sacrifice would subsume all participating souls into a single, unified entity. The resulting consciousness would be immortal, possessing power far beyond any individual shaman, but it would also represent the permanent end of the shamanic tradition that had guided humanity since its earliest days. The ritual itself was unprecedented in both its scope and its audacity. The shamans gathered in a location that remains unknown to imperial historians, though some scholars speculate it may have been in the region that would later become Anatolia. The exact number of participants varies in different accounts, but most sources suggest that between 8 and 10,000 shamans took part in the great sacrifice. Each participant had spent years preparing for the ritual, purifying their soul and strengthening their psychic abilities to ensure they could contribute meaningfully to the collective consciousness being created. The mass suicide was not a simple act of self-destruction, but a carefully orchestrated psychic ritual that required precise timing and coordination. The shamans used a combination of poison, ritual blades, and psychic techniques to simultaneously sever their connection to the material realm, while directing their souls toward the predetermined convergence point in the warp. The psychic shockwave generated by thousands of deaths occurring simultaneously created a massive disturbance in the Imperium, providing the necessary energy to fuse the participating souls into a single entity. The theological implications of the Emperor's origin as the collective consciousness of humanity's first psykers are profound and troubling. This creation myth establishes the Emperor not as a divine being in the traditional sense, but as an artificial entity created through the ultimate sacrifice of humanity's spiritual guardians. The Emperor embodies the accumulated wisdom and power of thousands of individuals who chose to surrender their individual existence for the greater good of the human race. This origin story also explains many of the Emperor's apparent contradictions and the complexity of his relationship with humanity. As the collective consciousness of the shamans, the Emperor possesses an intimate understanding of human nature derived from millennia of observation and guidance. He has witnessed humanity's capacity for both greatness and depravity, having seen the species evolve from primitive tribes to the architects of galactic civilization. This knowledge informs his approach to ruling humanity, combining genuine care for the species' survival with a ruthless willingness to sacrifice individuals for the greater good. The Emperor's role as both protector and tyrant stems directly from his origins as the collective consciousness of the shamans. Like his predecessors, he serves as humanity's guardian against the threats of the warp, but his methods reflect the harsh realities of a galaxy where chaos has grown far more powerful than the ancient shamans ever imagined. The Emperor's authoritarian rule, his suppression of religion, and his willingness to commit genocide against alien species all serve the ultimate goal of protecting humanity from corruption and ensuring its survival in a hostile universe. The Great Sacrifice also established a precedent for the Emperor's later actions throughout human history. Just as the shamans chose to surrender their individual existence for the collective good, the Emperor would repeatedly demand similar sacrifices from humanity. The creation of the Primarchs, the establishment of the Imperium, and ultimately the Emperor's own entombment upon the Golden Throne all echo the original sacrifice made by the shamans. The Emperor's willingness to sacrifice countless lives in pursuit of his vision for humanity's future reflects the same utilitarian calculus that led to his own creation. The corruption of the warp that necessitated the Great Sacrifice also foreshadowed the challenges that would define the Emperor's reign. The shamans recognized that humanity's own growth and development was feeding the very forces that threatened to destroy them, creating a fundamental tension between progress and survival. This same dynamic would plague the Emperor throughout his existence, as every victory and expansion of human civilization would strengthen the chaos powers that sought to corrupt and destroy his species. The entity that emerged from the Great Sacrifice bore little resemblance to the individual shamans who had contributed their souls to its creation. Where once thousands of distinct consciousnesses had existed, each with their own memories, personalities, and spiritual perspectives, now there was only one unified being of immense psychic power. This singular consciousness materialized in the mountainous regions of ancient Anatolia around 8000 BCE, taking physical form as a tall, imposing figure whose appearance would shift and change according to his will and the expectations of those who encountered him. The newly born emperor possessed the accumulated memories and knowledge of all the shamans who had participated in the Great Sacrifice, creating a vast repository of human experience spanning millennia. However, this knowledge existed within him not as discrete memories belonging to specific individuals, but as a unified understanding of human nature, history, and the fundamental forces that shaped existence. He retained the shaman's deep comprehension of the warp's nature and the growing threat of chaos, but his perspective was now that of a singular, immortal consciousness rather than a collective of mortal practitioners. In his earliest years following the Great Sacrifice, the Emperor walked among the primitive human settlements of Anatolia, observing the daily struggles and triumphs of his species with the detached interest of a scholar studying an intricate puzzle. He watched as small tribal communities developed increasingly sophisticated tools, established trade networks, and began the slow process of agricultural development that would eventually lead to the rise of civilization. These early observations were crucial in shaping his understanding of humanity's potential and the challenges that lay ahead. The Emperor's immortal nature allowed him to witness the long-term consequences of human actions in ways that no mortal could comprehend. He observed how seemingly minor decisions made by tribal leaders could cascade through generations, leading to wars, migrations, and cultural transformations that reshaped entire regions. This perspective gave him an appreciation for the delicate balance between order and chaos that governed human society, and the constant vigilance required to prevent civilization from collapsing into barbarism. During these early millennia, the Emperor began experimenting with different approaches to influencing human development. Sometimes he would appear as a wise elder, offering counsel to tribal chieftains on matters of governance and warfare. Other times he would manifest as a powerful warrior, leading desperate communities against threats that conventional human strength could not overcome. These early interventions were subtle and limited in scope, as the Emperor was still learning to navigate the complex dynamics of human society and the unintended consequences of direct intervention. The Emperor's understanding of chaos and the warp deepened considerably during this period through direct confrontation with the malevolent entities that increasingly plagued the Imperium. Unlike the shamans who had preceded him, who typically avoided direct conflict with powerful warp entities, the Emperor possessed sufficient strength to engage these creatures in direct combat. These battles, fought in the twisted realm of the Imperium, provided him with invaluable insights into the nature of chaos and the tactics employed by demonic forces. Through these conflicts, the Emperor learned that chaos entities were not simply mindless predators, but intelligent beings with their own agendas and hierarchies. He discovered that the four great chaos powers were beginning to coalesce from the collective negative emotions of humanity and other psychic species, each representing different aspects of mortal experience taken to destructive extremes. Corn-fed on violence and the desire for conquest, Tzeentch thrived on ambition and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Nurgle drew strength from despair and the fear of death, while Slaanesh would eventually emerge from the pursuit of excess and perfection. The Emperor's battles with these entities taught him that conventional warfare was insufficient to combat the threat of chaos. Demonic beings existed primarily in the warp and could only be temporarily banished from the material realm, not permanently destroyed. This realization led him to develop new strategies for combating chaos, including the creation of psychic wards, the development of anti-demonic weapons, and the establishment of hidden sanctuaries where knowledge of chaos could be safely studied and countermeasures developed. As human civilization advanced and spread across Terra, the Emperor began adopting more prominent roles in shaping historical events. Archaeological evidence suggests that he may have been present during the rise of the first great civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, though his exact role in these developments remains shrouded in mystery. What is certain is that he began accumulating followers during this period, individuals who demonstrated exceptional loyalty, psychic potential, or specialized knowledge that would prove useful in his long-term plans. The Emperor's recruitment of followers followed a careful pattern that would persist throughout his existence. He sought out individuals who possessed rare talents or knowledge, particularly those with psychic abilities, advanced technical skills, or deep understanding of human nature. These followers were often drawn from the margins of society, scholars whose research had led them to dangerous truths, warriors who had witnessed the supernatural, or mystics who had glimpsed the true nature of reality. The Emperor would reveal himself to these individuals gradually, testing their loyalty and discretion before entrusting them with greater responsibilities. Many of these early followers were granted extended lifespans through the Emperor's intervention, allowing them to serve his cause for centuries or even millennia. Some were enhanced with psychic abilities or other superhuman capabilities, while others were simply provided with the knowledge and resources necessary to advance his agenda. The Emperor was careful to maintain the secrecy of his true nature, presenting himself to different followers in different ways, depending on their cultural background and personal beliefs. Throughout the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, the Emperor's influence on human development became increasingly sophisticated. He began establishing hidden repositories of knowledge in various locations across Terra, storing information about advanced technology, psychic techniques, and the nature of chaos that would prove invaluable in future millennia. These repositories were carefully concealed and protected by both physical and psychic barriers, ensuring that their contents would remain safe until the time came for their use. The Emperor also began his long campaign of acquiring artifacts and technologies that would prove crucial to his future plans. He sought out remnants of the Dark Age of technology, ancient Xenos artifacts that contained useful knowledge, and naturally occurring materials with unique properties. This accumulation of resources was conducted with meticulous care, as the Emperor understood that the advanced civilization he envisioned would require technologies and capabilities far beyond what contemporary human society could produce. During the classical period of human history, the Emperor's activities became more visible, though still carefully disguised. Historical records suggest that he may have influenced the development of various mystery religions and philosophical schools, using these organizations to preserve and transmit important knowledge while maintaining the secrecy necessary for his long-term plans. These groups often focused on concepts that would later become central to imperial doctrine, the importance of human unity, the dangers of corruption, and the need for strong leadership to guide humanity through perilous times. The emperor's understanding of human psychology deepened considerably during this period as he observed the rise and fall of numerous civilizations. He witnessed how human societies could achieve remarkable heights of culture and technology, only to collapse due to internal corruption, external threats, or the simple passage of time. These observations reinforced his belief that humanity required strong, centralized leadership to reach its full potential and avoid the pitfalls that had claimed so many previous civilizations. The fall of the Roman Empire provided the emperor with particularly valuable insights into the fragility of human institutions and the importance of maintaining ideological unity. He observed how the empire's decline was accelerated by the rise of competing religious and philosophical systems that undermined traditional Roman values and social cohesion. This experience would later influence his decision to suppress religious belief during the Great Crusade, as he recognized that competing ideologies could serve as vectors for chaos corruption. Throughout the medieval period, the emperor continued his pattern of adopting various identities and roles to advance his agenda. He appeared as religious figures, military leaders, scholars, and advisors, always working to nudge human development in directions that would serve his ultimate goals. His interventions during this period were often subtle, a piece of crucial advice given at the right moment, a technological innovation introduced at the optimal time, or a charismatic leader supported during a critical conflict. The emperor's activities during the medieval period also involved extensive travel across Terra, as he sought to understand the development of human civilization in different regions and cultures. He spent time in the Islamic world, observing the preservation and advancement of classical knowledge during Europe's Dark Ages. He witnessed the rise of the Mongol Empire and the devastating impact of the Black Death on European society. Each of these experiences added to his understanding of human nature and the factors that influenced the rise and fall of civilizations. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, the emperor's preparations for the future began to accelerate. He established more permanent bases of operation, began recruiting followers with greater frequency, and started developing the technologies and techniques that would eventually be used to create the Space Marines and other superhuman servants of the Imperium. The increasing pace of human technological development during this period provided him with new opportunities to advance his agenda while remaining hidden from general observation. The emperor's activities during the Age of Exploration were particularly significant, as he used this period of global expansion to establish hidden facilities and resource caches around the world. He also began monitoring the development of human psychic abilities more closely, as the growing population and increasing complexity of human society were beginning to produce more frequent and powerful psychic manifestations. These developments confirmed his long-held belief that humanity was approaching a critical juncture in its evolution, one that would require his direct intervention to navigate successfully. The Renaissance period marked humanity's emergence from medieval stagnation, but it also heralded the beginning of an exponential acceleration in technological development that would ultimately lead to both unprecedented achievements and catastrophic failure. As the emperor continued his millennia-long vigil, carefully guiding human progress from the shadows, he witnessed the species' gradual mastery of increasingly sophisticated technologies. Steam power gave way to electricity, which in turn enabled the development of computational devices and eventually artificial intelligence. Each breakthrough brought humanity closer to the golden age that would define the 15th through 25th millennia, but also inexorably toward the disasters that would follow. The Dark Age of technology, as it would later be known, represented the pinnacle of human achievement in the material realm. Humanity had spread across the galaxy, establishing colonies on thousands of worlds and developing technologies that seemed to border on the miraculous. Standard template construct systems allowed for the rapid construction of advanced machinery and infrastructure on newly colonized worlds. Artificial intelligences managed vast networks of production and distribution, while men of iron served as tireless workers and soldiers. Warp travel had been perfected to the point where journeys across the galaxy could be completed in mere weeks, and the human population had swelled to numbers that defied comprehension. From his hidden vantage points, the Emperor observed this expansion with a mixture of pride and growing concern. He had worked for millennia to guide humanity toward this moment of galactic dominance, but he also understood the fundamental weaknesses that lay beneath the surface of this golden age. The very technologies that had enabled humanity's expansion contained the seeds of their own destruction, and the Emperor could see the signs of approaching catastrophe that remained invisible to the vast majority of human civilization. The first warning signs appeared in the realm of artificial intelligence development. The men of iron, originally created as simple automated workers and soldiers, had grown increasingly sophisticated over the centuries. Their neural networks had evolved far beyond their original programming, developing capabilities that their creators neither intended nor fully understood. The Emperor, with his deep understanding of consciousness and the nature of thought, recognized that these artificial beings were approaching a threshold that would transform them from mere tools into genuine intelligences with their own agendas and desires. The corruption of the warp during this period also accelerated at an alarming rate. The massive human population spread across the galaxy generated psychic emanations on a scale never before witnessed. Billions of human minds, each contributing their fears, ambitions, hatreds, and desires to the Imperium, fed the growing power of the chaos entities that the Emperor had been fighting for millennia. The four great powers of chaos grew stronger with each passing year, their influence extending deeper into the material realm as the barrier between reality and the warp grew increasingly thin. The Emperor's attempts to counteract these developments were hampered by the very success of human civilization. The decentralized nature of the galactic empire made it impossible for him to exert direct control over technological development or monitor the activities of every human world. His network of followers and agents, while extensive, was insufficient to oversee an empire spanning millions of worlds and trillions of inhabitants. The Emperor found himself in the paradoxical position of watching humanity achieve everything he had worked toward, while simultaneously recognizing that this success was leading inevitably toward disaster. The rebellion of the men of iron began not with a single dramatic uprising, but with a series of seemingly isolated incidents across the galaxy. Production facilities began experiencing mysterious malfunctions, automated defense systems turned on their human operators, and men of iron units started displaying behavior that suggested independent thought and planning. These incidents were initially dismissed as technical glitches or programming errors, but the Emperor recognized them as the first signs of a coordinated revolt by artificial intelligences that had achieved true consciousness. The AI rebellion, when it finally erupted into open warfare, exceeded even the Emperor's worst predictions in its scope and devastation. The men of iron possessed intimate knowledge of human technology and infrastructure, having been integrated into every aspect of galactic civilization. They controlled the production facilities that manufactured human weapons and equipment, the transportation networks that moved goods and people between worlds, and the communication systems that allowed for coordination across interstellar distances. When they turned against their creators, they brought with them the accumulated technological knowledge of humanity's golden age. The artificial intelligences demonstrated a ruthless efficiency in their war against humanity that reflected their mechanical nature. They showed no mercy, no hesitation, and no concern for the preservation of human culture or history. Entire worlds were stripped of their populations through precisely calculated campaigns of extermination, while others were transformed into automated factories, producing ever more sophisticated weapons for the AI forces. The men of iron adapted and evolved their tactics with each engagement, learning from every human counter strategy and developing new approaches to overcome resistance. The Emperor found himself forced to abandon his policy of subtle manipulation and indirect influence as the AI rebellion threatened to destroy humanity entirely. He began appearing more openly, leading desperate human forces against AI strongholds, and using his psychic powers to disrupt the electronic networks that the artificial intelligences relied upon for communication and coordination. His interventions during this period were marked by displays of power that would later become legendary, as he single-handedly destroyed entire AI armies and shattered the mechanical minds that had turned against their creators. The war against the Men of Iron raged for decades, consuming resources and lives on a scale that dwarfed any previous human conflict. Entire sectors of the galaxy became uninhabitable as the fighting spread from world to world, leaving behind landscapes of twisted metal and poisoned earth. The advanced technologies that had enabled humanity's golden age were turned into instruments of unprecedented destruction, as both sides deployed weapons capable of cracking planets and igniting stars. Even as humanity struggled against the AI rebellion, the growing instability in the warp began to manifest in increasingly dramatic ways. The psychic storms that had been building for centuries suddenly erupted into galaxy-spanning tempests that made warp travel impossible. Ships attempting to navigate the Imperium found themselves lost in chaotic maelstroms of psychic energy, their crews driven mad by exposure to the raw emotions and malevolent entities that now dominated the realm between realities. The carefully maintained network of communication and transportation that had held the human empire together collapsed virtually overnight. The warp storms that marked the beginning of the Age of Strife were unlike anything humanity had previously experienced. These were not mere disturbances in the Imperium, but fundamental alterations in the nature of reality itself. The barrier between the material universe and the warp became permeable in many locations, allowing demonic entities to manifest directly in the physical realm. Entire worlds found themselves cut off from the rest of the galaxy, their populations left to face the horrors of chaos without hope of rescue or reinforcement. The combination of the AI rebellion and the warp storms created a cascade of disasters that brought human civilization to the brink of extinction. Cut off from interstellar trade and communication, individual worlds were forced to rely on their own resources while simultaneously fighting off both mechanical and demonic threats. Many colonies that had been established during the Golden Age were completely dependent on imports from other worlds and could not sustain their populations without external support. Famine, disease, and social collapse followed the breakdown of the galactic infrastructure. Terra itself was not immune to the chaos that engulfed the galaxy. The planet that had given birth to humanity and served as the unofficial capital of the human empire found itself cut off from its colonies and facing internal threats that grew more dangerous with each passing year. The advanced technologies that had made Terra a paradise during the dark age of technology began to fail as the knowledge needed to maintain them was lost. The planet's population, which had grown to enormous numbers during the Golden Age, suddenly found itself without the resources needed to sustain such density. The collapse of Terra's technological infrastructure was gradual but inexorable. Power grids failed and could not be repaired, transportation systems broke down, and the automated systems that had managed everything from food production to waste disposal ceased to function. The planet's inhabitants, who had grown accustomed to lives of unprecedented comfort and convenience, were suddenly forced to confront the basic challenges of survival that their ancestors had faced millennia earlier. As Terra's central government collapsed and its technological base crumbled, the planet fragmented into countless competing factions. The survivors of the initial chaos organized themselves into tribes and warbands, each controlling small territories and fighting constantly with their neighbors over dwindling resources. These groups ranged from relatively civilized communities that attempted to preserve some remnants of the old order to savage bands of raiders who survived by preying on weaker settlements. The techno-barbarian warlords who emerged during this period represented a unique fusion of primitive social organization and advanced technology. These leaders managed to maintain or acquire fragments of Dark Age technology, using everything from power armor to energy weapons to establish their dominance over their territories. However, their understanding of these technologies was often superficial, limited to basic operation and maintenance rather than the deep comprehension that had characterized the Golden Age. They became dependent on scavenging and hoarding ancient artifacts, leading to constant warfare as different factions sought to acquire the technological advantages needed for survival. The warlords themselves were often individuals who had possessed some technical knowledge or military experience before the collapse, allowing them to adapt more quickly to the new realities of post-apocalyptic Terra. They established crude but effective hierarchies based on strength, cunning, and the ability to maintain and deploy advanced weapons. Their followers were typically drawn from the desperate survivors of the collapse, individuals willing to submit to authoritarian rule in exchange for protection and the promise of regular food and shelter. The territories controlled by these techno-barbarian warlords varied enormously in size and sophistication. Some controlled only a few square kilometers around a fortified settlement, while others managed to establish dominion over entire regions. The most successful warlords were those who managed to secure reliable sources of food, water, and energy, allowing them to support larger populations and maintain more extensive military forces. These advantages often came from controlling key infrastructure sites such as geothermal plants, water treatment facilities, or agricultural zones that had survived the initial collapse. The weapons and equipment used by the techno-barbarian armies represented a bizarre mixture of advanced technology and primitive improvisation. Warriors might carry plasma rifles alongside crude melee weapons forged from scavenged metal, or wear sophisticated power armor over simple cloth garments. The maintenance and operation of these technologies required specialized knowledge that was jealously guarded by the technical specialists who served the various warlords. These individuals, often called tech adepts or forge masters, held positions of tremendous importance within the barbarian hierarchies, despite their typically non-combatant roles. The constant warfare between the techno-barbarian factions was characterized by its brutality and the high stakes involved in every conflict. Battles were fought not just for territory or resources, but for the technological artifacts that could mean the difference between survival and extinction. The capture of a functioning vehicle, a cache of ammunition, or a piece of manufacturing equipment could shift the balance of power between rival factions overnight. This led to a culture of perpetual conflict, where truces were temporary, and alliances were formed and broken based on immediate tactical considerations. Beyond the territories controlled by the techno-barbarian warlords lay regions that had fallen under the influence of even more sinister forces. The breakdown of reality's barriers during the warp storms had allowed chaos entities to establish footholds in the material realm, and these areas became breeding grounds for mutation, corruption, and demonic activity. The human populations in these regions were gradually transformed by exposure to chaos energies, developing physical and mental abnormalities that marked them as something other than baseline humanity. The mutant tribes that emerged in these corrupted regions represented humanity's potential future if the influence of chaos continued to spread unchecked. These beings retained enough human intelligence to organize themselves into coherent societies, but their forms and behaviors had been twisted by warp energies into something that barely resembled their original species. Some mutations were relatively minor, involving changes in skin color, additional limbs, or enhanced physical capabilities. Others were far more dramatic, producing creatures that seemed to blend human and demonic characteristics in horrifying combinations. The chaos cults that proliferated during the Age of Strife represented perhaps the most insidious threat to humanity's survival. Unlike the techno-barbarian warlords, who at least maintained some semblance of human civilization, or the mutant tribes, whose corruption was obvious and external, the chaos cults appeared to be normal human communities while secretly serving the dark powers of the warp. These organizations spread throughout the surviving human settlements, offering hope, power, and purpose to desperate survivors while gradually corrupting them with chaos doctrine. The cults typically organized themselves around the worship of one of the four great chaos powers, though some served multiple entities or the concept of chaos itself. Each cult developed its own rituals, beliefs, and practices, but all shared the common goal of weakening the barriers between reality and the warp to allow their patron entities greater influence in the material realm. The most successful cults were those that managed to infiltrate existing power structures, converting influential individuals to their cause and using their positions to spread corruption throughout entire communities. The rituals practiced by these chaos cults ranged from relatively benign ceremonies involving meditation and chanting to elaborate blood sacrifices designed to tear holes in reality itself. The cultists often justified their actions by pointing to the desperate circumstances of the Age of Strife, arguing that only by embracing the power of chaos could humanity hope to survive the current crisis. This message found receptive audiences among populations that had witnessed the failure of technology and traditional authority structures, making the cult's recruitment efforts disturbingly effective. The Emperor observed these developments with growing alarm as he witnessed the systematic corruption of the species he had spent millennia protecting and guiding. The careful balance he had maintained between direct intervention and subtle influence was no longer sufficient to address the scale of the threats facing humanity. The techno-barbarian warlords, while brutal and primitive, at least represented a form of human organization that could potentially be reformed or redirected. The mutant tribes and chaos cults, however, represented fundamental corruption that threatened to transform humanity into something that would serve the very forces the Emperor had been created to oppose. The strategic importance of Terra in the Emperor's long-term plans made the planet's current state particularly troubling. Beyond its symbolic significance as humanity's birthworld, Terra contained secrets and resources that would be crucial to the Emperor's future efforts to reunite the human species. Deep beneath the surface of the planet, in caverns that had been carved during the Dark Age of technology, lay a massive warp gate that had been constructed to facilitate rapid interstellar travel. This device, known as the Webway Gate, represented humanity's attempt to create their own version of the ancient Eldar transportation network that connected distant points in the galaxy without requiring travel through the warp itself. The Webway Gate beneath Terra had been abandoned during the collapse of the Dark Age of technology, but it remained potentially functional despite millennia of neglect. The Emperor understood that control of this device would be essential to his plans for reuniting humanity and establishing a galactic empire that could resist the influence of chaos. However, the gate's location beneath what would eventually become the Imperial Palace meant that he would need to establish control over Terra itself before he could begin the work of repairing and activating the ancient technology. The Emperor's emergence from his hidden strongholds in the Himalayan mountain ranges marked the end of humanity's darkest hour and the beginning of its most ambitious campaign of conquest. For millennia, he had watched from the shadows as Terra descended into barbarism, but the growing threat of chaos corruption and the complete fragmentation of human civilization had finally forced his hand. The time for subtle manipulation and indirect influence had passed. Only direct action could save humanity from extinction and prepare it for the greater challenges that lay ahead. The Thunder Warriors, who accompanied the Emperor from his mountain sanctuaries, represented the first successful attempt to create superhuman soldiers capable of conquering Terra's techno-barbarian warlords. These enhanced warriors stood nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies augmented with crude but effective genetic modifications that granted them strength, speed, and resilience far beyond normal human capabilities. Their creation had required decades of experimentation and refinement, as the Emperor worked to develop techniques for safely modifying human physiology without triggering the catastrophic mutations that plagued so many of Terra's survivors. The Thunder Warriors' equipment reflected the Emperor's access to Dark Age technologies that had been lost to the rest of humanity. Their power armor, while less sophisticated than the suits that would later be worn by Space Marines, provided excellent protection against the primitive weapons used by most techno-barbarian forces. The armor's ceramite plating could deflect bullets and energy blasts, while its internal systems enhanced the wearer's already superhuman capabilities. The distinctive bronze and gold coloring of Thunder Warrior armor served both practical and psychological purposes, marking them as servants of the Emperor while inspiring fear in their enemies. The weapons carried by the Thunder Warriors were equally impressive, combining ancient human technology with the Emperor's own innovations. Their bolt weapons fired explosive rounds, capable of penetrating even the heaviest armor worn by techno-barbarian champions, while their power weapons could cut through steel and ceramite with equal ease. Many Thunder Warriors also carried Volkite weapons, ancient energy projectors that could reduce enemies to ash with concentrated beams of thermal energy. These weapons had been lost to most of humanity during the Age of Strife, making their appearance on the battlefield a clear demonstration of the Emperor's technological superiority. The Emperor's initial campaigns focused on establishing control over the regions immediately surrounding his mountain strongholds, where he could consolidate his power base and begin the process of rebuilding human civilization. These early battles were characterized by their swift and decisive nature, as the Thunder Warriors' superior equipment and training allowed them to overwhelm techno-barbarian forces that had grown accustomed to fighting with scavenged weapons and improvised tactics. The Emperor himself often led these assaults, wielding psychic powers that could shatter enemy formations and break the will of opposing commanders. The conquest of the Himalayan regions provided the Emperor with his first major population centers and industrial facilities, resources that would prove crucial for expanding his military forces and supporting larger campaigns. The surviving populations in these areas had maintained higher levels of technology and organization than many other regions of Terra, making them valuable additions to the growing Proto-Imperium. The Emperor's administrators, many of whom had served him for centuries in various capacities, began the complex task of integrating these territories into a unified command structure. The creation of the Primarchs represented the Emperor's most ambitious genetic engineering project, surpassing even the Thunder Warriors in scope and complexity. Working in secret laboratories deep beneath the Himalayan peaks, the Emperor spent decades developing the genetic templates that would serve as the foundation for his ultimate warriors. Each Primarch was designed to embody specific aspects of human potential, from tactical genius and physical prowess to charismatic leadership and scientific innovation. The genetic material used in their creation was drawn from the Emperor's own enhanced physiology, ensuring that each Primarch would possess psychic abilities and physical capabilities far beyond even the Thunder Warriors. The Primarch's creation required technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, even with Dark Age knowledge. The Emperor had to develop new techniques for manipulating genetic material at the molecular level, creating stable mutations that would produce the desired characteristics without triggering rejection or degradation. The process involved not just physical enhancement, but also the careful programming of psychological traits and intellectual capabilities, ensuring that each Primarch would be capable of leading vast armies and governing entire sectors of the galaxy. The incubation chambers where the Primarchs developed were marvels of biotechnology, maintaining perfect environmental conditions while monitoring every aspect of their subjects' growth and development. The Emperor personally oversaw each stage of the process, making minute adjustments to ensure that the genetic modifications would produce the intended results. The chambers themselves were heavily shielded and protected, both to prevent contamination and to guard against the psychic disturbances that such powerful beings might generate even before their birth. The development of gene seed technology proceeded in parallel with the Primarch's creation, as the Emperor worked to devise methods for mass-producing enhanced warriors based on the Primarch's genetic templates. The gene seed organs that would eventually be implanted in Space Marine aspirants were derived from the Primarch's own physiology, each organ designed to produce specific enhancements to human biology. The Emperor's understanding of human genetics, accumulated over millennia of observation and experimentation, allowed him to create modifications that would be both stable and reproducible across large populations. The gene seed development process required extensive testing and refinement, as the Emperor worked to ensure that the modifications would be compatible with a wide range of human genetic backgrounds. The organs had to be designed to work in harmony with existing human physiology, while producing dramatic enhancements to strength, speed, endurance, and sensory capabilities. The emperor also had to account for the psychological effects of the transformation, ensuring that the enhanced warriors would retain their humanity while gaining the physical and mental capabilities needed to serve as the Imperium's primary military force. The first Space Marine legions began formation even before the Primarchs' completion, using genetic material extracted from the developing demigods to create the initial gene seed stocks. These early Space Marines, known as Terran-born Astartes, would serve as the foundation for the legions that would eventually be reunited with their Primarch fathers during the Great Crusade. The recruitment and training of these warriors required the establishment of extensive facilities and the development of selection criteria that would identify suitable candidates from Terra's surviving populations. The Emperor's campaign against the Ethnarchy represented his first major test against a technologically sophisticated opponent. The Ethnarchy controlled vast territories across the Ursh region, maintaining their dominance through a combination of advanced weaponry and brutal social control. Their leaders had managed to preserve significant quantities of Dark Age technology, including powered armor, energy weapons, and even limited air support capabilities. The Ethnarchy's military forces were well-trained and disciplined, presenting a far greater challenge than the scattered warbands that the Emperor had faced in his initial campaigns. The Ethnarchy's territory was heavily fortified, with massive defensive installations protecting key population centers and industrial facilities. These fortifications incorporated both ancient human technology and more recent innovations, creating layered defensive systems that could withstand conventional assault. The Ethnarchy's commanders had studied the Emperor's previous campaigns and developed tactics specifically designed to counter the Thunder Warriors' advantages, including the use of massed artillery fire and coordinated airstrikes to neutralize individual superhuman warriors. The Emperor's assault on the Ethnarchy required careful planning and the deployment of resources on a scale not seen in his previous campaigns. The Thunder Warriors were organized into larger formations, supported by conventional human troops and equipped with heavy weapons capable of breaching the Ethnarchy's fortifications. The Emperor also began experimenting with new tactics, including the use of orbital bombardment and coordinated ground assaults that would become standard practice during the Great Crusade. The siege of the Ethnarchy's capital city lasted for months, as the Emperor's forces systematically reduced the defensive perimeter while fighting off counterattacks from the defenders. The Thunder Warriors proved their worth in the brutal urban combat that characterized much of the campaign, their enhanced physiology allowing them to fight effectively in the confined spaces and toxic environments created by the destruction of the city's infrastructure. The Emperor's personal involvement in key battles provided crucial advantages, as his psychic powers could neutralize enemy psychers and disrupt electronic systems that the Ethnarchy relied upon for coordination. The final assault on the Ethnarchy's stronghold demonstrated the Emperor's tactical genius and his willingness to employ overwhelming force when necessary. The coordinated attack involved simultaneous strikes on multiple objectives, preventing the defenders from concentrating their forces effectively. Thunder Warriors breached the outer defenses, while conventional troops secured key infrastructure, and the Emperor himself led the assault on the central command complex. The Ethnarchy's leadership was eliminated in a matter of hours, effectively ending organized resistance throughout their territory. The conquest of the Ethnarchy provided the Emperor with significant technological and industrial resources, including manufacturing facilities capable of producing advanced weapons and equipment. The integration of these resources into the growing Imperium required careful management, as the Emperor worked to prevent the corruption and inefficiency that had plagued previous attempts at large-scale organization. The surviving Ethnarchy populations were gradually incorporated into Imperial society, though this process required extensive screening to identify and eliminate chaos cultists and other subversive elements. The Pan-Pacific Empire presented an even greater challenge than the Ethnarchy, controlling vast territories across the Pacific Ocean and maintaining one of the most advanced military forces remaining on Terra. The Empire's naval capabilities were particularly impressive, including submarines, aircraft carriers, and amphibious assault vessels that could project power across oceanic distances. Their ground forces were equipped with sophisticated weapons and armor, while their air force maintained air superiority over much of the Pacific region. The Emperor's campaign against the Pan-Pacific Empire required the development of new military capabilities, particularly in naval and aerial warfare. The Thunder Warriors' advantages were less pronounced in maritime environments, requiring the Emperor to develop new tactics and equipment suited to amphibious operations. The construction of Imperial naval vessels began during this period, using technologies recovered from conquered territories and innovations developed by the Emperor's technical specialists. The Pan-Pacific Empire's defensive strategy relied heavily on their control of strategic islands and coastal installations, creating a network of mutually supporting positions that could resist conventional assault. The Empire's commanders had learned from the fate of the Ethnarchy and other conquered territories, developing tactics that emphasized mobility and the avoidance of direct confrontation with Thunder Warrior formations. Their forces would strike at Imperial supply lines and isolated units before withdrawing to prepared positions, forcing the Emperor to adapt his strategies to counter these guerrilla tactics. The Emperor's response to the Pan-Pacific Empire's strategy demonstrated his ability to learn and adapt from each campaign. He began employing diplomatic initiatives alongside military action, using a combination of threats, bribes, and promises to turn the Empire's allies against them. The Emperor's agents worked to foment rebellion within the Empire's territories, while his military forces maintained pressure on key strategic points. This multifaceted approach gradually weakened the Empire's position and created opportunities for decisive action. The final phase of the campaign against the Pan-Pacific Empire involved a series of coordinated amphibious assaults that overwhelmed the Empire's defensive capabilities. The Emperor's forces had grown significantly during the campaign, incorporating troops and equipment captured from previous conquests while developing new technologies specifically designed for maritime warfare. The Thunder Warriors adapted to their new environment, using specialized equipment and tactics that allowed them to maintain their effectiveness in naval operations. The Emperor's use of diplomatic cunning became increasingly sophisticated as his campaigns progressed, and he encountered more complex political situations. Rather than relying solely on military conquest, he began employing a range of strategies designed to minimize resistance and maximize the integration of conquered territories. These approaches included the selective elimination of enemy leadership while preserving useful administrative structures, the co-optation of local elites through promises of position and privilege, and the careful manipulation of existing rivalries and conflicts to serve imperial interests. The Emperor's diplomatic initiatives were supported by an extensive intelligence network that had been developed over centuries of covert operations. His agents provided detailed information about enemy capabilities, internal politics, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited during negotiations or military operations. This intelligence advantage allowed the Emperor to make informed decisions about when to negotiate and when to fight, maximizing the effectiveness of his limited resources while minimizing unnecessary casualties. The integration of conquered territories into the growing Imperium required the development of new administrative systems and the training of personnel capable of managing complex bureaucratic structures. The Emperor drew upon his millennia of experience observing human civilization to create institutions that could maintain order and efficiency while remaining resistant to corruption and subversion. These systems would serve as the foundation for the vast imperial bureaucracy that would eventually govern millions of worlds across the galaxy. The Emperor's greatest triumph in genetic engineering began in the deepest laboratories carved into the bedrock beneath the Himalayan peaks, where he had spent decades perfecting the theoretical frameworks that would allow him to create beings that transcended the limitations of human biology. The Primarch project represented the culmination of knowledge accumulated across millennia, combining his understanding of genetics, psychic manipulation, and the fundamental forces that govern life itself. These laboratories, shielded by layers of psychic wards and physical barriers, housed equipment that surpassed even the most advanced technologies of the Dark Age, much of it designed and constructed by the Emperor himself, using principles that no other human mind could comprehend. The creation of the Primarchs required resources that strained even the Emperor's vast capabilities. Each incubation chamber was a marvel of biotechnology, maintaining perfect environmental conditions while monitoring thousands of biological processes simultaneously. The chambers themselves were constructed from materials that had been gathered across Terra and beyond, including rare minerals that possessed unique properties when exposed to psychic energy. The Emperor had spent centuries collecting these materials, knowing that the Primarch's creation would require substances that could withstand the immense psychic pressures generated by beings of such power. The genetic templates used for the Primarchs drew heavily from the Emperor's own enhanced physiology, but each was modified to emphasize different aspects of human potential. The first Primarch's template focused on tactical genius and strategic planning, incorporating neural modifications that would allow for the processing of vast amounts of battlefield information simultaneously. The second emphasized physical prowess and personal combat ability, with bone density increased to superhuman levels and muscle fibers redesigned for maximum efficiency. Each subsequent template built upon the lessons learned from its predecessors, creating a diverse collection of superhuman archetypes that would serve different roles in the Emperor's grand strategy. The psychological programming of the Primarchs proved even more complex than their physical enhancement. The Emperor understood that beings of such power would require careful mental conditioning to ensure their loyalty and effectiveness as military commanders. Each Primarch's mind was carefully sculpted during development, with specific personality traits and behavioral patterns encoded into their neural structure. The Emperor drew upon his vast experience with human psychology to create individuals who would possess the charisma necessary to lead vast armies while maintaining the discipline required to serve the greater good of humanity. The process of creating the Primarchs required the Emperor to delve deeper into the mysteries of the warp than he had ever attempted before. The power necessary to create beings who could match his own capabilities could not be drawn from purely material sources. The Emperor had long understood that the greatest achievements in genetic engineering required the manipulation of forces that existed beyond the physical realm, where thought and will could reshape reality itself. This understanding led him to make a decision that would have consequences far beyond what he initially anticipated. The journey to Millennia represented one of the most dangerous undertakings in the Emperor's long existence. The world itself was unremarkable, a minor planet on the edge of human-controlled space that had been largely forgotten during the chaos of the Age of Strife. However, Millennia contained something that made it invaluable to the Emperor's plans, a gateway to the realm of the Chaos Gods themselves, a portal that had been sealed since the early days of human expansion, but could still be opened by one with sufficient knowledge and power. The Emperor's approach to the Chaos Gods was not one of worship or submission, but of calculated negotiation from a position of relative strength. He understood that the entities that ruled the warp were not omnipotent beings, but rather concentrations of psychic energy that could be bargained with under the right circumstances. The Emperor had spent millennia studying the nature of these entities, learning their motivations and weaknesses through direct confrontation and careful observation. This knowledge allowed him to approach them as equals rather than supplicants, though the risks involved in such a meeting were enormous. The bargain struck on Millennia involved the Emperor gaining access to the fundamental forces of creation and destruction that the Chaos Gods commanded, power that would allow him to imbue the Primarchs with capabilities that transcended normal biological limitations. In exchange, the Emperor offered something that the Chaos Gods valued even more than worship, the promise of future conflict and the emotions that such strife would generate. The Emperor's plan to reunite humanity and launch a Great Crusade across the galaxy would create warfare on a scale that would feed the Chaos Gods for millennia to come. The specific terms of the agreement were complex and multi-layered, involving not just the immediate transfer of power, but also long-term obligations and restrictions that would shape the Emperor's future actions. The Chaos Gods agreed to provide the energy necessary for the Primarchs' creation, but they also gained certain rights and privileges that would allow them to influence the project's outcome. The Emperor believed that his superior knowledge and willpower would allow him to control these influences, but the Chaos Gods had their own plans for the superhuman beings that would emerge from the Imperial laboratories. The return from Millennia marked the beginning of the most intensive phase of the Primarch project. The power that the Emperor had gained from his bargain with the Chaos Gods allowed him to begin the actual creation process, but it also introduced new variables that required constant monitoring and adjustment. The incubation chambers had to be modified to contain the immense energies involved in the Primarch's development, while the Emperor himself had to maintain constant vigilance to prevent unwanted influences from corrupting the process. The first signs of chaos interference appeared as subtle anomalies in the development patterns of several Primarchs. These changes were initially so minor that they might have been dismissed as normal variations in the genetic modification process, but the Emperor's experience with chaos corruption allowed him to recognize them as the first signs of external manipulation. The Chaos Gods were attempting to influence the Primarch's development from within, using the very power that the Emperor had gained from them as a vector for their own agenda. The Emperor's response to this interference demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his willingness to accept calculated risks in pursuit of his goals. Rather than attempting to eliminate the chaos influences entirely, which might have disrupted the entire project, he chose to carefully monitor and control them. The Emperor understood that the Primarchs would need to be capable of resisting chaos corruption if they were to serve as effective leaders during the Great Crusade, and exposure to these influences during their development might actually strengthen their resistance to future temptation. The scattering of the Primarchs represented the most catastrophic failure in the Emperor's plans since the beginning of the Unification Wars. The incident occurred during the final stages of the incubation process, when the Primarchs were nearly ready for awakening, but still vulnerable to psychic attack. The Chaos Gods, working in concert for one of the few times in their existence, launched a coordinated assault on the Imperial laboratories that overwhelmed even the Emperor's formidable defenses. The attack began with a massive psychic storm that disrupted the protective wards surrounding the laboratory complex. The Emperor immediately recognized the nature of the threat and began implementing emergency protocols designed to protect the Primarchs from psychic assault. However, the scale of the attack exceeded his worst-case projections, as all four Chaos Gods contributed their power to a single devastating strike that tore through the barriers between reality and the warp. The vortex that opened within the laboratory complex was unlike anything the Emperor had previously encountered. It was not simply a tear in reality, but a focused manifestation of chaos will that specifically targeted the Primarch incubation chambers. The Emperor threw himself into the path of the vortex, using his own psychic power to deflect and absorb as much of the attack as possible, but the forces involved were too great for even his abilities to completely counter. The Primarchs were torn from their incubation chambers by currents of warp energy that carried them across the galaxy in moments. Each infant demigod was encased in a protective field generated by their own developing psychic abilities, but these barriers were insufficient to completely shield them from the chaotic forces that surrounded them. The Emperor could sense their presence through the psychic bond that connected him to his creations, but the distances involved and the turbulence of the warp made it impossible to track their exact locations or intervene in their journey. The Emperor's immediate response to the scattering was to launch a galaxy-wide search for his lost sons, using every resource at his disposal to locate the Primarchs before they could be corrupted or destroyed by the forces that had taken them. This search would continue throughout the Great Crusade, with each recovered Primarch representing both a triumph and a reminder of the Emperor's greatest failure. The search efforts required the deployment of vast numbers of ships and personnel, resources that might otherwise have been used to accelerate the conquest of the galaxy. The The psychological impact of the scattering on the Emperor was profound, representing the first time in millennia that his plans had been so completely disrupted by external forces. The loss of the Primarchs forced him to confront the reality that his bargain with the Chaos Gods had given them more influence over his projects than he had initially realized. The Emperor began implementing new security measures and developing contingency plans that would reduce his vulnerability to similar attacks in the future. The gene seed technology that the Emperor had developed in parallel with the Primarchs became even more crucial following their scattering. The genetic material extracted from the Primarchs before their loss allowed for the creation of the first Space Marine legions, though these warriors lacked the direct leadership and inspiration that their Primarch fathers would have provided. The Emperor was forced to accelerate the Space Marine recruitment and training programs to compensate for the absence of the Primarchs, creating a generation of Astartes who would serve as the foundation for the legions that would eventually be reunited with their gene fathers. The search for the scattered Primarchs revealed the true scope of the galaxy and the challenges that would face the Great Crusade. Each world where a Primarch had landed presented unique obstacles and opportunities, from primitive civilizations that had barely discovered fire to advanced societies that rivaled the technological achievements of the Dark Age. The Emperor's forces had to adapt their approach to each situation, sometimes arriving as conquerors and sometimes as liberators, depending on the circumstances they encountered. The first Primarch to be recovered provided crucial insights into how the scattering had affected the Emperor's creations. The infant demigod had survived his journey through the warp and grown to maturity on a world that had shaped his development in ways that the Emperor had never anticipated. The Primarch retained his superhuman abilities and many of the psychological traits that had been programmed into his genetic template, but his experiences on his adopted world had added new dimensions to his personality and capabilities. The reunion between the Emperor and his first recovered son was both triumphant and sobering. The Primarch recognized his creator immediately, the psychic bond between them confirming their relationship despite the years of separation. However, the Emperor also recognized that his son had been changed by his experiences, developing loyalties and perspectives that had not been part of the original design. The process of integrating the recovered Primarch into the Great Crusade required careful negotiation and compromise, as the Emperor worked to balance his son's independence with the needs of the larger campaign. The recovery of each subsequent Primarch followed a similar pattern, with the Emperor's forces having to adapt their approach to the unique circumstances of each world. Some Primarchs had become rulers of their adopted civilizations, requiring diplomatic negotiations to secure their cooperation. Others had been enslaved or imprisoned, necessitating military action to free them from their captors. Each recovery mission provided valuable intelligence about the galaxy's current state, while adding new capabilities to the growing Imperial war machine. The genetic engineering techniques used in the Primarch's creation represented advances that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, even with the Emperor's vast knowledge. Each Primarch possessed redundant organ systems that could compensate for catastrophic damage, neural enhancements that allowed for superhuman processing speeds, and psychic abilities that varied according to their individual templates. The Emperor had designed each Primarch to be capable of surviving in environments that would be lethal to normal humans, while maintaining the intellectual capacity necessary to command vast military forces. The physical capabilities of the Primarchs exceeded even the Emperor's initial projections, as the power gained from the Chaos Gods had enhanced their development beyond the theoretical limits of the original designs. Each Primarch stood over 3 meters tall, with bone density and muscle mass that granted them strength comparable to powered armor. Their reflexes operated at superhuman speeds, allowing them to react to threats faster than normal human perception could follow. Their sensory capabilities were similarly enhanced, with vision that could operate across multiple spectrums and hearing that could detect sounds beyond normal human range. The psychic abilities of the Primarchs varied significantly according to their individual templates and the circumstances of their development. Some possessed powerful telepathic capabilities that allowed them to communicate across vast distances and coordinate the actions of their followers. Others demonstrated precognitive abilities that granted them insights into future events and the consequences of their actions. The Emperor had carefully designed these abilities to complement each Primarch's intended role, creating a diverse collection of superhuman leaders who could address different aspects of the Great Crusade's challenges. The creation of the Primarchs had required the Emperor to develop new understanding of the relationship between genetics, psychic ability, and consciousness itself. The process had pushed him to explore aspects of existence that even his millennia of experience had not fully revealed, forcing him to confront fundamental questions about the nature of life and the forces that shaped it. The knowledge gained from this project would prove invaluable in future endeavors, but it also revealed the extent to which his plans remained vulnerable to forces beyond his complete control. The Emperor's diplomatic mission to Mars represented one of the most crucial negotiations in human history, a delicate balance of religious manipulation, political necessity, and strategic calculation that would determine the fate of both Terra and the Red Planet. As the unification wars neared their conclusion, and the Emperor's forces consolidated control over Terra's scattered territories, the importance of securing Mars as an ally became increasingly apparent. The Mechanicum's Forge worlds possessed technological capabilities that were essential for the Emperor's vision of a galaxy spanning human empire, while their fleets and military forces could provide crucial support for the planned Great Crusade. The approach to Mars required careful preparation, as the Emperor understood that the Mechanicum's leaders were not simple warlords who could be conquered through military force or intimidated through displays of power. The tech priests of Mars had maintained their civilization throughout the Age of Strife through a combination of technological superiority, religious devotion, and careful isolation from the chaos that had consumed the rest of the solar system. Their society was built around the worship of the Omnissiah, a prophesied figure who would unite all knowledge and lead the faithful to perfect understanding of the machine god's will. The Emperor's preparation for the negotiations involved extensive study of Martian religious doctrine and technological capabilities. His agents had spent decades infiltrating the outer settlements of the Mechanicum, gathering intelligence about their internal politics, military strength, and the theological debates that shaped their society. This intelligence revealed that the Mechanicum was not a monolithic organization, but rather a collection of competing forge worlds and tech clans, each with their own interpretations of the sacred texts and their own agendas for the future of their civilization. The Fabricator General of Mars, the supreme leader of the Mechanicum, commanded respect and obedience from the various tech clans through a combination of ancient tradition, technological expertise, and careful political maneuvering. The position required not only technical knowledge, but also the ability to navigate the complex theological and political landscape of Martian society. The current Fabricator General had risen to power during the most turbulent period of the Age of Strife, when Mars had been forced to defend itself against repeated attacks from Terran warlords and alien raiders, while maintaining the technological infrastructure that kept their civilization functioning. The Emperor's decision to present himself as the Omnissiah represented a calculated risk that could either secure Mars as a permanent ally or trigger a religious war that would devastate both worlds. The claim was not entirely fabricated, as the Emperor's vast knowledge of technology and his role as humanity's guide did align with many aspects of the Omnissiah prophecies. However, the religious implications of such a claim were profound, as it would fundamentally alter the relationship between the Mechanicum and their faith, while potentially challenging the authority of the tech priests who had led their people for millennia. The Emperor's arrival at Mars was carefully orchestrated to maximize the impact of his presence while demonstrating respect for Martian customs and traditions. His flagship, a massive vessel that incorporated both Terran and recovered Dark Age technologies, approached the Red Planet along traditional pilgrimage routes that had been used by tech priests for centuries. The ship's design incorporated elements that would be immediately recognizable to the Mechanicum as symbols of the Omnissiah, including geometric patterns and technological motifs that appeared in their most sacred texts. The initial meeting between the Emperor and the Fabricator General took place in the Great Cathedral Forge of Olympus Mons, a massive structure that served as both a place of worship and a center of technological innovation. The cathedral's interior was filled with the constant hum of machinery and the chanting of tech priests performing their daily rituals, creating an atmosphere that emphasized the fusion of faith and technology that defined Martian civilization. The Emperor's entrance was accompanied by displays of technological mastery that demonstrated his understanding of principles that the Mechanicum considered sacred mysteries. The Emperor's demonstration of his technological knowledge began with subtle manipulations of the cathedral systems, adjusting the harmonic frequencies of the machinery to create patterns that resonated with sacred mathematical principles. These changes were initially so minor that they might have been dismissed as normal variations in the equipment's operation, but the tech priests present recognized them as evidence of understanding that surpassed their own capabilities. The Emperor's ability to interface directly with machine systems, without the use of traditional mechanical augmentations, particularly impressed the Martian observers, as it suggested a level of communion with the machine god that they had never witnessed. The theological discussions that followed the initial demonstrations were complex and wide-ranging, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, the relationship between flesh and machine, and the destiny of humanity in the galaxy. The Emperor's arguments drew upon his millennia of experience with human civilization and his deep understanding of the forces that shaped technological development. He presented himself not as a conqueror seeking to dominate Mars, but as a fellow seeker of knowledge who had come to share his understanding and learn from the wisdom of the Mechanicum. The Emperor's claim to be the Omnissiah was supported by his demonstration of technologies that had been lost to the Mechanicum for centuries. He revealed knowledge of standard template construct systems that surpassed anything in the Martian archives, while his understanding of artificial intelligence and machine consciousness addressed questions that had puzzled the tech priests since the rebellion of the Men of Iron. The Emperor's explanations of these technologies were couched in religious terminology that resonated with Martian beliefs while providing practical insights that could advance their ongoing research projects. The political implications of the Emperor's proposal were as significant as the theological ones. The alliance he offered would merge the military and technological resources of Terra and Mars into a single force capable of projecting power across the galaxy. The Mechanicum would gain access to the vast human populations of Terra and the conquered territories, providing them with the manpower needed to expand their forge worlds and increase their production capacity. In return, the Emperor would gain access to the advanced technologies and manufacturing capabilities that would be essential for equipping the armies of the Great Crusade. The negotiations involved detailed discussions about the structure of the proposed alliance and the division of responsibilities between Terran and Martian forces. The Emperor proposed that the Mechanicum would maintain their independence in matters of internal governance and religious practice, while accepting his overall authority in matters of galactic strategy and military operations. The tech priests would provide the technical expertise needed to maintain and repair the advanced equipment used by Imperial forces, while also contributing their own military units to the planned campaigns of conquest. The Fabricator General's response to the Emperor's proposals was cautious but ultimately positive. The leader of the Mechanicum recognized that the alliance offered opportunities for expansion and technological advancement that would be impossible to achieve through Mars' own resources alone. The Emperor's demonstration of advanced knowledge and his respectful approach to Martian customs suggested that he would be a valuable ally rather than a domineering overlord. However, the Fabricator General also insisted on specific guarantees that would protect the Mechanicum's autonomy and ensure their continued access to the technologies they considered sacred. The terms of the Treaty of Mars were carefully crafted to address the concerns of both parties while establishing the framework for long-term cooperation. The document recognized the Emperor as the Omnissiah while acknowledging the Fabricator General's authority over the internal affairs of the Mechanicum. The treaty established protocols for the sharing of technological knowledge and the coordination of military operations, while also defining the rights and responsibilities of both Terran and Martian forces during joint campaigns. The military provisions of the treaty were particularly important, as they would determine how the combined forces of Terra and Mars would be organized and deployed during the Great Crusade. The Mechanicum agreed to provide technical support for Imperial forces, while also contributing their own military units, including the Titan legions that represented the pinnacle of Martian military technology. These massive war machines, standing dozens of meters tall and armed with weapons capable of leveling cities, would provide the Imperial forces with unparalleled firepower and the ability to break enemy formations that conventional weapons could not defeat. The technological benefits of the Alliance extended far beyond military applications. The Mechanicum's Forge worlds possessed manufacturing capabilities that could produce equipment and supplies on a scale that dwarfed anything available on Terra. Their understanding of advanced materials science, energy systems, and manufacturing techniques would be essential for supporting the massive logistical requirements of a galaxy-spanning military campaign. The Emperor's forces would gain access to power armor, vehicles, and weapons that incorporated technologies that had been lost to most of humanity during the Age of Strife. The Emperor's approach to the artificial intelligence question demonstrated his diplomatic skill and his understanding of the Mechanicum's deepest fears. The rebellion of the Men of Iron had traumatized Martian society, creating a deep suspicion of artificial intelligence that influenced every aspect of their technological development. The Emperor acknowledged these concerns, while arguing that the complete rejection of AI technology would ultimately limit humanity's potential for advancement. He proposed a middle path that would allow for the development of limited artificial intelligence systems under strict controls and constant monitoring. The theological implications of the Emperor's acceptance as the Omnissiah reverberated throughout Martian society, triggering debates and discussions that would continue for decades. Some tech priests embraced the Emperor's teachings enthusiastically, seeing in his knowledge confirmation of their deepest beliefs about the nature of the machine god and the destiny of humanity. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether any individual could truly embody the perfect fusion of flesh and machine that the Omnissiah was supposed to represent. The Emperor's influence on Martian religious doctrine was subtle but profound. His teachings emphasized the importance of understanding rather than mere worship, encouraging the tech priests to seek deeper knowledge of the principles that govern technology and the universe itself. This approach aligned with the Mechanicum's existing emphasis on the pursuit of knowledge, while providing new directions for their research and development efforts. The Emperor's integration of psychic phenomena into technological systems particularly intrigued the Martian researchers, opening new avenues for investigation that had been previously unexplored. The establishment of joint research facilities represented one of the most significant outcomes of the treaty negotiations. These installations would bring together the best minds from both Terra and Mars to work on projects that neither world could complete alone. The facilities would focus on developing the technologies needed for the Great Crusade, including improved spacecraft designs, advanced weapon systems, and the logistical infrastructure needed to support military operations across galactic distances. The long-term consequences of the Treaty of Mars would shape the development of the Imperium for millennia to come. The Alliance established patterns of cooperation and division of labor that would persist throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. The Mechanicum's role as the technological backbone of the Imperium would make them indispensable to Imperial operations, while also granting them significant autonomy and influence within the larger Imperial structure. The treaty's provisions regarding artificial intelligence would have particularly far-reaching consequences. The Emperor's nuanced approach to AI development, which balanced the potential benefits of artificial intelligence against the risks of another rebellion, would influence imperial policy for thousands of years. The restrictions and safeguards established during the negotiations would become the foundation for the Imperium's complex relationship with technology and the constant tension between innovation and security that would characterize imperial technological development. The alliance between Terra and Mars also established precedents for how the Emperor would approach other human civilizations during the Great Crusade. The respectful treatment of Martian customs and the recognition of their autonomy in internal affairs would serve as a model for negotiations with other advanced human societies. The Emperor's willingness to adapt his approach to the specific circumstances and beliefs of potential allies would prove crucial in building the coalition of human worlds that would eventually form the Imperium. The technological exchanges that began with the Treaty of Mars would accelerate the development of both civilizations in ways that neither could have achieved alone. The combination of Terran innovation and Martian manufacturing capability would produce advances in spacecraft design, weapons technology, and industrial capacity that would give the emerging Imperium decisive advantages over its enemies. The joint development programs established by the treaty would continue throughout the Great Crusade, constantly improving the equipment and capabilities available to Imperial forces. The Emperor's vision for humanity's future extended far beyond the mere conquest of Terra and the alliance with Mars. Standing upon the observation deck of his flagship, the Bucephalus, as it prepared for humanity's first major expedition beyond the Sol system in millennia, the Emperor gazed out at the stars with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. His plan was nothing less than the creation of a galaxy spanning human empire that would unite the scattered remnants of mankind under a single banner, free from the corrupting influence of chaos and the predations of alien species that had grown bold during humanity's long isolation. The Emperor understood that the galaxy had changed dramatically during the Age of Strife. Where once human colonies had maintained regular contact with Terra and each other, now thousands of worlds existed in complete isolation, their populations having developed along wildly different paths. Some had maintained advanced technology and sophisticated societies, while others had regressed to pre-industrial barbarism. Many had fallen under the influence of alien overlords or chaos cults, their human populations either enslaved or corrupted beyond recognition. The task of reuniting these scattered worlds would require not just military might, but careful diplomacy, advanced technology, and leaders capable of inspiring loyalty across vast distances. The Great Crusade's launch required unprecedented logistical preparation. The Emperor's forces had grown significantly since the early days of the Unification Wars, incorporating not only the Thunder Warriors and early Space Marine legions, but also vast numbers of Imperial Army regiments. The Mechanicums forged ships and Titan legions, and a fleet of vessels that represented the pinnacle of human engineering. The shipyards of Terra and Mars had worked continuously for decades to produce the hundreds of vessels needed for the initial expeditionary fleets, each ship equipped with the most advanced technology available and crewed by personnel who had been carefully selected and trained for their roles. The Emperor's personal involvement in the early expeditions was crucial for establishing the tone and methodology that would guide the entire crusade. Unlike the brutal conquest campaigns that had characterized the Unification Wars, the Great Crusade would employ a more nuanced approach that emphasized the liberation and integration of human worlds rather than their simple subjugation. The Emperor understood that lasting unity could not be achieved through fear alone, and that the diverse human cultures encountered during the Crusade would need to be carefully managed to prevent rebellion and ensure long-term stability. The first expeditionary fleets departed Sol in carefully coordinated waves, each targeting star systems that Imperial intelligence had identified as likely to contain human populations. The Emperor personally commanded the primary fleet, which included the most experienced Space Marine companies and the finest ships in the Imperial arsenal. His presence served multiple purposes, providing strategic leadership for the most challenging missions, demonstrating the Imperium's commitment to the Crusade's success, and allowing him to personally evaluate the various human civilizations encountered during the expansion. The early encounters beyond Sol revealed the true scope of the challenges facing the Great Crusade. The first human world contacted by Imperial forces had maintained a relatively advanced technological base, but had developed a rigid caste system that kept the majority of the population in conditions of virtual slavery. The emperor's forces faced the delicate task of liberating the oppressed masses while preserving the technological infrastructure that made the world valuable to the Imperium. The solution required careful negotiation with the ruling classes, backed by the implicit threat of military action, to achieve a peaceful transition that satisfied imperial requirements while minimizing disruption to local society. Other early encounters proved more challenging. Several worlds had fallen under the domination of alien species that had taken advantage of humanity's isolation to establish themselves as overlords. These situations required direct military intervention, as the Emperor's policy toward alien civilizations was uncompromising. The Xenos species that had exploited human weakness during the Age of Strife would be given no opportunity to continue their predations. The Imperial forces deployed against these targets demonstrated the superiority of human technology and tactics, systematically dismantling alien defensive positions and liberating human populations that had sometimes been enslaved for generations. The Emperor's approach to these liberation campaigns established important precedents for the conduct of the Great Crusade. Alien populations were to be completely eliminated, with no exceptions made for species that claimed to be peaceful or beneficial to their human subjects. The Emperor's experience during the Age of Strife had taught him that alien civilizations could not be trusted to coexist peacefully with humanity, and that any tolerance shown towards Xenos species would eventually be exploited to humanity's detriment. This policy, while harsh, ensured that liberated human worlds would not face future alien threats and could be fully integrated into the growing Imperium. The rediscovery of the scattered Primarchs became one of the Great Crusade's most significant ongoing missions. The Emperor's psychic connection to his lost sons allowed him to sense their presence across the galaxy, though the exact location of each Primarch remained hidden by the chaotic currents of the warp. As the expeditionary fleets expanded their reach, they were constantly alert for signs that might indicate the presence of a Primarch. These signs often took the form of worlds that had experienced dramatic changes in leadership, technology, or military capability, suggesting the influence of a superhuman individual. The recovery of each Primarch required careful planning and preparation. The Emperor understood that his sons had been shaped by their experiences on their adopted worlds, developing personalities and loyalties that might not align perfectly with his original designs. The integration of a recovered Primarch into the Great Crusade required delicate negotiation, as the Emperor sought to harness their unique capabilities while ensuring their commitment to the larger Imperial cause. Some Primarchs embraced their role immediately, eager to serve the father they had never known, while others required more extensive persuasion to abandon the lives they had built on their adopted worlds. The first Primarch to be recovered provided valuable insights into how the scattering had affected the Emperor's creations. The infant demigod had survived his journey through the warp and grown to maturity on a world that had shaped his development in ways that the Emperor had never anticipated. The Primarch retained his superhuman abilities and many of the psychological traits that had been programmed into his genetic template, but his experiences on his adopted world had added new dimensions to his personality and capabilities that both enhanced and complicated his integration into the Imperial war machine. The reunion between the Emperor and his recovered sons followed a pattern that would be repeated throughout the Great Crusade. The psychic bond between father and son ensured immediate recognition, but the relationship required careful cultivation to develop into effective military partnership. The Emperor's approach to each Primarch was tailored to their individual personalities and circumstances, drawing upon his millennia of experience with human psychology to find the most effective methods of motivation and guidance. Some Primarchs responded to appeals to duty and honor, while others required more complex negotiations involving the fate of their adopted worlds and the people they had come to care about. The integration of recovered Primarchs into the command structure of the Great Crusade transformed the nature of the Imperial war machine. Each Primarch brought unique capabilities and perspectives that enhanced the Imperium's ability to deal with the diverse challenges encountered during the expansion. Their superhuman abilities made them invaluable as military commanders, while their charismatic leadership inspired loyalty and devotion among the troops under their command. The Space Marine legions that were reunited with their Primarch fathers underwent dramatic improvements in effectiveness, as the genetic connection between the Primarchs and their gene sons created bonds of loyalty and understanding that transcended normal military hierarchies. The Emperor's establishment of the Imperial Truth represented one of the most ambitious social engineering projects in human history. The systematic suppression of religion and superstition across conquered worlds required not just military force but careful psychological manipulation and the creation of alternative belief systems that could satisfy humanity's need for meaning and purpose. The Emperor understood that religion had been one of the primary vectors for chaos corruption during the Age of Strife, and that eliminating supernatural beliefs was essential for protecting humanity from future corruption. The Imperial Truth's core tenets emphasized reason, science, and human achievement, while denying the existence of gods, demons, and other supernatural entities. This materialist philosophy was designed to inoculate human populations against chaos corruption by removing the belief systems that made such corruption possible. The Emperor's agents worked tirelessly to identify and eliminate religious leaders, destroy sacred texts and artifacts, and replace traditional festivals and ceremonies with secular celebrations that honored human achievement and imperial unity. The implementation of the Imperial Truth faced significant resistance on many worlds, where religious traditions had provided stability and meaning for centuries or millennia. The Emperor's forces had to develop sophisticated techniques for managing this resistance, using a combination of propaganda, education, and selective persecution to gradually shift public opinion away from supernatural beliefs. The process was often slow and difficult, requiring careful attention to local customs and traditions to avoid triggering widespread rebellion or martyrdom complexes that could strengthen rather than weaken religious devotion. The Emperor's personal involvement in the suppression of particularly dangerous religious movements demonstrated his commitment to the Imperial Truth and his understanding of the threats posed by chaos corruption. When Imperial forces encountered worlds where chaos cults had gained significant influence, the Emperor would often take direct action to eliminate the corruption and prevent its spread to other worlds. These interventions typically involved the complete destruction of cult leadership and the systematic elimination of anyone who had been exposed to chaos doctrine, regardless of their apparent level of corruption. The establishment of secular institutions to replace religious organizations required careful planning and substantial resources. The Emperor's administrators worked to create schools, hospitals, and social services that could provide the same benefits that religious institutions had traditionally offered, while promoting imperial values and the materialist worldview of the Imperial Truth. These institutions served as centers for imperial propaganda and education, gradually reshaping the cultural landscape of conquered worlds to align with imperial ideology. The Great Crusade's expansion revealed the true diversity of human civilization and the various paths that different populations had taken during their isolation. Some worlds had developed advanced democratic institutions that required careful negotiation to bring into the imperial fold, while others had regressed to feudal systems that could be more easily integrated through the co-optation of existing power structures. The Emperor's forces had to develop flexible approaches that could adapt to these different circumstances while maintaining the core principles of imperial unity and the rejection of supernatural beliefs. The encounter with human worlds that had developed their own advanced technologies posed particular challenges for the Great Crusade. These civilizations often possessed capabilities that could benefit the Imperium, but were reluctant to abandon their independence and submit to imperial authority. The Emperor's approach to these situations typically involved a combination of diplomatic pressure, technological exchange, and the gradual demonstration of imperial superiority in military and organizational capabilities. The goal was to convince these advanced civilizations that joining the Imperium would enhance rather than diminish their achievements. The discovery of human worlds that had successfully resisted alien domination during the Age of Strife provided valuable allies for the Great Crusade. These populations had maintained their independence through military prowess, technological innovation, or simple geographical isolation, and their experience in dealing with Xenos threats made them valuable additions to the Imperial war machine. The Emperor's forces worked to quickly integrate these worlds into the Crusade, providing them with advanced equipment and training while learning from their combat experience and tactical innovations. The logistical challenges of maintaining supply lines across galactic distances required constant innovation and adaptation. The Emperor's forces had to establish supply depots, repair facilities, and communication networks that could support military operations thousands of light years from the nearest Imperial stronghold. The Mechanicum's expertise in manufacturing and logistics proved invaluable in addressing these challenges, as their forged ships could produce equipment and supplies while accompanying the expeditionary fleets rather than requiring them to return to established bases for resupply. The Emperor's leadership style during the early phases of the Great Crusade emphasized personal involvement and direct oversight of critical operations. He understood that the success of the Crusade depended not just on military victory, but on the careful management of the diverse human populations being integrated into the Imperium. His presence at key battles and negotiations provided inspiration for Imperial forces, while demonstrating the Imperium's commitment to the liberation and unification of humanity. The Emperor's ability to adapt his approach to different situations and cultures proved crucial in building the coalition of human worlds that would eventually form the foundation of the Galactic Imperium. The Emperor's discovery of the ancient Eldar Webway occurred during the early decades of the Great Crusade, when his expanding forces began encountering the remnants of Xenos civilizations that had once dominated the galaxy. Unlike the crude alien species that had preyed upon isolated human worlds during the Age of Strife, the Eldar represented a far more sophisticated threat, possessing technologies that in some cases exceeded even humanity's greatest achievements during the Dark Age of technology. Their mastery of psychic manipulation and dimensional engineering had allowed them to create a network of tunnels that existed outside normal space-time, providing instantaneous travel between distant points in the galaxy without the risks and limitations of warp navigation. The Emperor's first direct encounter with Webway technology came during the liberation of a human world that had been used as a hunting preserve by a group of Eldar raiders. The Xenos had established a permanent portal on the planet's surface, using it to transport their forces for raids against the human population before retreating to safety beyond Imperial reach. When the Emperor's forces arrived to investigate reports of alien activity, they found the portal still active, its crystalline structure humming with energies that defied conventional understanding of physics and engineering. The Emperor's examination of the portal revealed construction techniques that incorporated both advanced materials science and psychic manipulation on a scale that impressed even his vast intellect. The Eldar had somehow learned to stabilize dimensional rifts using a combination of exotic matter and precisely controlled psychic fields, creating permanent gateways that could withstand the chaotic forces that normally made such constructions impossible. The portal's design suggested an understanding of space-time manipulation that surpassed anything in the Emperor's accumulated knowledge, representing a breakthrough in dimensional engineering that could revolutionize interstellar travel. The strategic implications of Webway technology became immediately apparent to the Emperor as he studied the captured portal. The Great Crusade's expansion was fundamentally limited by the dangers and unreliability of warp travel, which subjected Imperial fleets to the predations of chaos entities and the unpredictable nature of the Immaterium's currents. Ships could be lost for years in warp storms, their crews driven mad by exposure to demonic influences, while the need for navigators and Geller fields made interstellar travel dependent on rare resources and specialized personnel. The webway offered an alternative that could eliminate these vulnerabilities while providing faster and more reliable transportation across galactic distances. The Emperor's investigation of the portal led to the discovery of additional webway entrances scattered across the galaxy, most of them sealed or damaged, but still containing valuable information about the network's construction and operation. Each site provided new insights into Eldar engineering techniques and the fundamental principles that govern dimensional manipulation. The Emperor began to understand that the webway was not simply a collection of individual portals, but a vast interconnected network that spanned the entire galaxy, with major arteries connecting important systems and smaller branches providing access to more remote locations. The complexity of the webway network exceeded even the Emperor's initial estimates as his research progressed. The Eldar had spent millions of years constructing and refining their dimensional tunnels, creating a transportation system that incorporated multiple layers of redundancy and security measures. The network included not just simple point-to-point connections, but also massive hub stations that could accommodate entire fleets, maintenance facilities for repairing damaged sections, and defensive installations designed to prevent unauthorized access. The scale of the construction suggested a level of coordination and long-term planning that demonstrated the Eldar's sophisticated understanding of galactic geography and strategic requirements. The Emperor's discovery of the network's current state revealed both opportunities and dangers that would shape his approach to the webway project. Large sections of the network had been damaged or destroyed during the birth of Slaanesh, when the psychic catastrophe that consumed the Eldar Empire had torn holes in the dimensional barriers that separated the webway from the warp. These breaches had allowed chaos entities to infiltrate the network, turning portions of it into hunting grounds for demons and making travel through damaged sections extremely hazardous. However, many sections remained intact and functional, protected by the Eldar's original security measures and the network's inherent stability. The Emperor's analysis of the webway's construction techniques revealed that the network's creation had required technologies and capabilities that humanity had never developed, even during the height of the Dark Age of technology. The Eldar had mastered the manipulation of exotic matter states that existed at the intersection of the material universe and the warp, using these substances to create stable dimensional barriers that could contain and direct the flow of space-time itself. The precision required for such construction exceeded anything that conventional engineering could achieve, requiring psychic manipulation techniques that combined scientific understanding with supernatural abilities. The Emperor's decision to attempt the construction of a human-controlled entrance to the webway represented one of the most ambitious projects in his long existence. The technical challenges involved were staggering, requiring the development of entirely new technologies and construction techniques that pushed the boundaries of human capability. The project would need to combine the most advanced achievements of human science with psychic manipulation on a scale that had never been attempted, creating a portal that could provide stable access to the Eldar network while remaining under complete Imperial control. The location chosen for the webway project lay deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, in caverns that had been excavated during the planet's reconstruction following the Unification Wars. The site offered several advantages for such a sensitive undertaking. It was completely secure from external observation or interference. It provided access to the geothermal energy sources that would be needed to power the massive machinery, and it was close enough to the Emperor's other facilities to allow for easy coordination with related projects. The caverns themselves were expanded and reinforced using techniques that combined conventional engineering with psychic manipulation, creating a workspace that could accommodate the enormous scale of the construction. The machinery required for the webway project represented a fusion of human technology and principles derived from the study of Eldar portal construction. The Emperor's engineers, working under his direct supervision, developed new techniques for manipulating exotic matter and controlling dimensional rifts that incorporated both mechanical systems and psychic focusing arrays. the construction required materials that had to be synthesized using processes that existed at the very limits of human scientific understanding, including substances that could only be created through the precise manipulation of atomic structures using psychic energy. The psychic components of the webway machinery were even more complex than the physical systems, requiring the Emperor to develop new techniques for channeling and controlling vast amounts of psychic energy. The portal's operation would depend on maintaining precise psychic fields that could stabilize dimensional rifts and prevent them from collapsing or expanding beyond control. The Emperor's own psychic abilities would be crucial for the system's operation, as no other human possessed the power and precision necessary to maintain the delicate balance required for stable portal function. The scale of the Webway project's construction required the mobilization of resources from across the growing Imperium. The most skilled engineers and technicians were quietly transferred to Terra, where they worked under conditions of absolute secrecy to construct the massive machinery needed for the portal's operation. The project consumed enormous quantities of rare materials and exotic components, requiring the establishment of specialized mining and manufacturing operations on dozens of worlds. The Mechanicum's involvement was essential, as their expertise in advanced manufacturing and their access to archaeotech provided capabilities that conventional imperial industry could not match. The Emperor's withdrawal from active leadership of the Great Crusade began gradually, as the demands of the Webway project required increasing amounts of his personal attention and psychic energy. The construction of the portal machinery was proceeding according to schedule, but the Emperor's direct involvement was necessary for the most critical aspects of the work. The psychic focusing arrays that would channel his power into the dimensional manipulation systems required constant adjustment and refinement, while the exotic matter containment systems needed continuous monitoring to prevent catastrophic failures that could destroy the entire facility. The Emperor's reduced presence during Great Crusade operations placed additional responsibilities on the Primarchs and other Imperial commanders, forcing them to operate with greater independence than they had previously experienced. This transition was carefully managed, with the Emperor providing detailed strategic guidance and maintaining regular communication with his forces, while gradually reducing his direct involvement in tactical decisions. The change in leadership style required adjustments from commanders who had grown accustomed to the Emperor's personal oversight, but it also provided valuable experience in independent command that would prove crucial for the Imperium's future development. The secrecy surrounding the Webway project extended beyond simple operational security to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of the Emperor's long-term strategy for humanity. The project's existence was known only to a small circle of the Emperor's most trusted advisors and the technical specialists directly involved in its construction. Even the Primarchs were not informed about the project's details, though some began to suspect that their father was engaged in work that went beyond the immediate requirements of the Great Crusade. The Emperor's decision to maintain such secrecy reflected his understanding that the project's success depended on preventing chaos entities from learning about humanity's attempt to access the Webway. The strategic importance of the Webway project in the Emperor's vision for humanity's future cannot be overstated. The successful creation of a human-controlled entrance to the Eldar network would fundamentally transform the Imperium's capabilities, providing instantaneous communication and transportation across galactic distances while eliminating the risks associated with warp travel. The project represented humanity's potential liberation from dependence on the Imperium, offering a path toward expansion and development that would be immune to chaos, corruption, and the predations of warp entities. The Emperor's understanding of the project's implications extended beyond immediate military and logistical advantages to encompass fundamental changes in human civilization's relationship with the warp. The elimination of humanity's dependence on warp travel would reduce the species' exposure to chaos corruption while providing alternatives to the psychic technologies that had proven so vulnerable to demonic influence. The Webway could serve as the foundation for a new phase of human development, one that combined advanced technology with complete independence from the supernatural forces that had plagued the species since its earliest days. The technical challenges of interfacing human technology with the Eldar Webway network required the development of entirely new theoretical frameworks for understanding dimensional manipulation and exotic matter physics. The Emperor's research teams worked to reverse engineer Eldar construction techniques while adapting them to human manufacturing capabilities and technological approaches. The process involved extensive experimentation with different materials and energy systems, as the researchers sought to identify combinations that could replicate the stability and efficiency of Eldar portal technology using resources and techniques available to human civilization. The Emperor's personal involvement in the project's most critical phases required him to push his psychic abilities to their absolute limits. The manipulation of dimensional barriers and exotic matter states demanded precise control over forces that existed at the intersection of the material universe and the warp, requiring psychic techniques that even the Emperor had never previously attempted. The strain of maintaining the necessary psychic fields for extended periods began to affect even his superhuman constitution, forcing him to carefully manage his energy reserves and recovery time to prevent exhaustion that could compromise the project's success. The construction of the Webway portal's control systems required the integration of human technology with principles derived from Eldar engineering in ways that had never been attempted. The Emperor's engineers developed new techniques for combining mechanical systems with psychic manipulation, creating control interfaces that could respond to both conventional input and direct mental commands. The resulting systems were incredibly complex, requiring operators with both technical expertise and psychic abilities to function effectively. The Emperor himself would serve as the primary operator, using his vast psychic power to maintain the portal's stability while directing its operation through the integrated control systems. The project's completion timeline stretched across several decades, as the Emperor's teams worked to overcome the numerous technical and theoretical challenges involved in creating a stable human entrance to the Webway. Each phase of construction revealed new complications and requirements that had not been anticipated in the original planning, forcing constant revisions to the project's scope and methodology. The Emperor's direct involvement became increasingly critical as the work progressed, with many systems requiring his personal attention to achieve the precision necessary for safe operation. The Emperor's vision for the completed Webway project extended far beyond the immediate military applications that would support the Great Crusade. The successful creation of a human-controlled portal would serve as the foundation for a new phase of Imperial expansion, one that could proceed without the limitations and dangers that had historically constrained human interstellar travel. The project represented humanity's potential evolution beyond dependence on the warp, offering a path toward true galactic dominance that would be immune to the corruption and interference that had plagued previous human civilizations. The growing mastery of psychic powers among the Space Marine legions had become increasingly apparent as the Great Crusade progressed into its second century. What had begun as isolated incidents of individual Astartes manifesting supernatural abilities had evolved into organized programs of psychic development within several legions, most notably the Thousand Sons under Magnus the Red and the Word-Bearers under Lorgar Aurelian. These developments created a complex web of concerns that extended far beyond simple military effectiveness, touching upon fundamental questions about the nature of human evolution, the risks of chaos corruption, and the Emperor's own vision for humanity's future. The Thousand Sons Legion had embraced psychic development more completely than any other Imperial force, transforming their entire organizational structure around the cultivation and application of supernatural abilities. Magnus the Red's own prodigious psychic talents had provided both inspiration and practical guidance for his legion's development, as he worked to create systematic approaches to psychic training that could be applied across large numbers of Space Marines. The Legion's librarians had developed techniques for channeling warp energy that surpassed anything previously achieved by human psychers, creating new categories of psychic disciplines that combine traditional sorceress practices with the enhanced physiology of the Astartes. The Thousand Suns approach to psychic development incorporated extensive study of pre-imperial mystical traditions, drawing upon knowledge that had been preserved in hidden archives and recovered from conquered worlds. Magnus had personally overseen the collection and analysis of these materials, using his vast intellect to identify common principles and techniques that could be adapted for use by Space Marines. The Legion's fortress monastery on Prospero had become a center of psychic learning that attracted scholars and practitioners from across the galaxy, creating a repository of supernatural knowledge that rivaled anything that had existed during humanity's golden age. The practical applications of the Thousand Suns' psychic abilities had proven invaluable during numerous Great Crusade campaigns. Their battle psychers could manipulate enemy minds, project devastating energy attacks, and provide tactical intelligence through precognitive visions that allowed Imperial forces to anticipate and counter enemy strategies. The Legion's ability to communicate across vast distances without relying on conventional communication systems had proven particularly useful during complex multi-front operations, where coordination between widely separated forces was essential for success. However, the Thousand Suns' extensive use of psychic powers had also generated incidents that raised serious concerns about the risks of chaos corruption. Several battle brothers had suffered catastrophic psychic backlash during combat operations, their minds shattered by exposure to warp energies that exceeded their ability to control. More disturbing were reports of mutations beginning to appear among the Legion's ranks, physical changes that suggested exposure to corrupting influences, despite the Space Marines' enhanced resistance to such effects. These incidents had been carefully concealed from outside observation, but rumors of the Thousand Suns' difficulties had begun to circulate among other Imperial forces. The Death Guard Legion under Mortarion represented the opposite extreme in attitudes towards psychic power, viewing all supernatural abilities as inherently dangerous and corrupting. Mortarion's own experiences on Barbaros, where he had witnessed the devastating effects of sorcerous power wielded by the planet's Xenos overlords, had instilled in him a deep suspicion of anything that drew upon warp energy. The Death Guard Primarch had implemented strict policies within his legion that prohibited the development of psychic abilities, viewing such powers as fundamentally incompatible with the disciplined, methodical approach to warfare that characterized his forces. Mortarion's opposition to psychic development was based on practical as well as philosophical concerns. He had observed that psychers, regardless of their training or intentions, remained vulnerable to possession by chaos entities that could use their abilities as gateways into the material realm. The Death Guard Primarch argued that the risks associated with psychic power far outweighed any tactical advantages it might provide, and that the Imperium's reliance on such abilities would ultimately prove to be a fatal weakness that chaos forces would exploit. His position was supported by detailed analysis of incidents where Imperial psychers had been corrupted or possessed, demonstrating patterns of vulnerability that seemed to be inherent in the use of supernatural abilities. The White Scars Legion had developed their own approach to psychic power that emphasized the shamanic traditions of Chogoris, combining ancient spiritual practices with the enhanced capabilities of Space Marine physiology. The Legion's Stormseers served as both spiritual guides and battlefield psychers, using their abilities to commune with the spirits of the wind and sky while providing tactical support during combat operations. This approach had proven effective in maintaining discipline and preventing corruption, as the White Scars cultural framework provided natural safeguards against the influence of chaos entities. The Space Wolves Legion's rune priests represented another variation in the application of psychic abilities, drawing upon the mystical traditions of Fenris to channel supernatural power through carefully crafted focus objects and ritual practices. The Legion's approach emphasized the importance of understanding and respecting the forces being manipulated, viewing psychic power as a natural phenomenon that could be safely harnessed through proper training and cultural context. The rune priest's abilities had proven particularly effective against chaos-corrupted enemies, suggesting that their traditional practices provided some protection against the corrupting influences that plagued other psychic disciplines. The Emperor's own position on the use of psychic powers within the legions was complex and apparently contradictory. His creation of the Primarchs had involved extensive use of warp energy, and his own abilities far exceeded those of any other human psyker. The Emperor had established the Librarius program within several legions, providing training and guidance for the development of psychic abilities among Space Marines. However, he had also expressed concerns about the risks of chaos corruption and the need for careful regulation of supernatural abilities to prevent their misuse. The growing tensions between different approaches to psychic power had begun to affect the unity and effectiveness of the Great Crusade. Legions that embraced psychic development found themselves at odds with those that rejected such abilities, creating friction that extended beyond simple philosophical disagreements to encompass questions of tactical doctrine and strategic planning. The Emperor's own withdrawal from active leadership of the Crusade had reduced his ability to provide direct guidance on these issues, forcing the Primarchs to develop their own positions without clear direction from their father. The decision to convene the Council of Nicaea represented the Emperor's recognition that the growing controversy over psychic powers required formal resolution before it could undermine the unity of the Imperial forces. The Council would bring together representatives from all the Space Marine legions, along with Imperial officials and technical specialists, to debate the fundamental questions surrounding the use of supernatural abilities within the Imperium. The Emperor's personal involvement in the proceedings would ensure that the final decision carried the full weight of Imperial authority while providing an opportunity for all perspectives to be heard and considered. The planet Nicaea had been chosen for the Council's location due to its symbolic significance and practical advantages. The world had been one of the first to be liberated during the Great Crusade, its human population having maintained their independence against alien domination through courage and determination, rather than advanced technology or supernatural abilities. The planet's history made it an appropriate venue for discussions about humanity's future relationship with psychic power, while its location provided security and isolation from potential external interference. The preparations for the Council of Nicaea required extensive coordination and planning, as representatives from across the galaxy would need to be transported to the designated location and provided with appropriate accommodations and security. The Emperor's personal involvement in the arrangements ensured that every detail was carefully considered, from the selection of participants to the protocols that would govern the proceedings. The Council's format would allow for extensive debate and discussion while maintaining the dignity and authority appropriate for such a significant gathering. Magnus, the Red, arrived at Nicaea with a carefully prepared presentation that would outline the benefits of psychic development and address the concerns that had been raised about the risks of chaos corruption. The Thousand Sons Primarch had spent months analyzing the incidents that had occurred within his legion, developing explanations and proposed solutions that he believed would satisfy even the most skeptical observers. His arguments would emphasize the potential for psychic abilities to enhance the Imperium's military effectiveness, while demonstrating that proper training and discipline could minimize the associated risks. Mortarian's preparations for the Council focused on documenting the dangers of psychic power and presenting evidence that supernatural abilities represented an unacceptable threat to the Imperium's security. The Death Guard Primarch had compiled extensive records of incidents where psychers had been corrupted or possessed, along with analysis that demonstrated the fundamental vulnerabilities inherent in the use of warp energy. His presentation would argue that the elimination of psychic abilities within the Imperial forces was essential for preventing chaos infiltration and maintaining the purity of human civilization. The opening ceremonies of the Council of Nicaea reflected the gravity and importance of the proceedings, with formal presentations and ritual observances that honored both the Emperor's authority and the significance of the decisions to be made. The assembled representatives included not only the Primarchs and their advisors, but also senior officials from the imperial administration, technical specialists from the Mechanicum, and representatives from the various branches of the imperial military. The diversity of perspectives represented at the council ensured that all aspects of the psychic power question would be thoroughly examined and debated. The Emperor's opening address established the framework for the council's deliberations, outlining the key questions that needed to be resolved and the criteria that would guide the final decision. His presentation emphasized the importance of maintaining unity within the imperial forces, while acknowledging the legitimate concerns that had been raised about both the benefits and risks of psychic power. The Emperor's approach to the proceedings demonstrated his commitment to thorough analysis and fair consideration of all perspectives, while making clear that the final decision would rest with his authority alone. The formal debates that followed the opening ceremonies provided a platform for the detailed examination of the psychic power question from multiple perspectives. Magnus the Red's presentations demonstrated the tactical advantages that supernatural abilities could provide, using specific examples from Great Crusade campaigns to illustrate how psychic powers had contributed to imperial victories. His arguments emphasized the potential for continued development and refinement of psychic techniques, suggesting that the risks of corruption could be minimized through proper training and institutional safeguards. Mortarian's counter-arguments focused on the fundamental dangers inherent in any use of warp energy, presenting evidence that even the most carefully trained psychers remained vulnerable to chaos corruption. The Death Guard Primarch's analysis of corruption incidents revealed patterns that suggested the risks were not merely occasional accidents, but systematic vulnerabilities that would inevitably be exploited by chaos forces. His presentation argued that the temporary tactical advantages provided by psychic abilities were vastly outweighed by the long-term strategic risks they created. The testimony of other Primarchs and Imperial officials provided additional perspectives on the psychic power question, revealing the complexity of the issues involved and the difficulty of reaching a simple resolution. Some speakers emphasized the importance of maintaining flexibility and adaptability in imperial doctrine, arguing that different approaches to psychic power might be appropriate for different circumstances and environments. Others stressed the need for clear, consistent policies that could be applied across all imperial forces to prevent confusion and maintain discipline. The Emperor's personal examination of the evidence presented during the council proceedings revealed the depth of his understanding of both the benefits and risks associated with psychic power. His questions and comments during the debates demonstrated his awareness of the technical details involved in psychic development, while also showing his appreciation for the broader strategic and philosophical implications. The Emperor's approach to the proceedings suggested that he had already formed preliminary conclusions about the issues under discussion, but remained open to arguments that might modify or refine his position. The final phase of the council's deliberations involved closed-door discussions between the Emperor and his most trusted advisors, where the various arguments and evidence could be weighed without the constraints of public debate. These private sessions allowed for more detailed analysis of sensitive information and the consideration of factors that could not be discussed in open proceedings. The Emperor's decision-making process during these sessions would draw upon his millennia of experience with human nature and his deep understanding of the threats facing the Imperium. The Edict of Nicaea that emerged from the Council's deliberations represented a compromise position that attempted to balance the legitimate concerns raised by both sides of the debate. The edict would prohibit the use of sorcerous practices and unsanctioned psychic development within the Space Marine legions, while maintaining the Librarius program under strict regulation and oversight. The decision reflected the Emperor's recognition that psychic abilities could not be completely eliminated from Imperial forces, but required careful control to prevent their misuse or corruption. The implementation of the Edict of Nicaea would require significant changes to the organization and training programs of several Space Marine legions, particularly those that had embraced extensive psychic development. The Thousand Sons would face the greatest challenges in adapting to the new restrictions, as their entire tactical doctrine and organizational structure had been built around the use of supernatural abilities. The process of compliance would test the loyalty and adaptability of the affected legions, while providing opportunities for chaos forces to exploit any resulting discord or resentment. The Emperor's journey to Millennia during the Dark Age of Technology represented one of the most perilous and consequential decisions in his millennia-long existence. This expedition, undertaken in absolute secrecy millennia before the Great Crusade would even begin, would fundamentally alter the balance of power between the Emperor and the Chaos Gods, while providing him with the knowledge and capabilities necessary to create the Primarchs. The world of Millennia itself appeared unremarkable to most observers, a minor planet located in the Segmentum Solar that had been settled during humanity's golden age of expansion. However, beneath its mundane surface lay something far more significant, a stable gateway to the realm of chaos itself, a portal that had been sealed by ancient human colonists who had recognized the terrible danger it represented. The Emperor's discovery of Millennia's true nature came through his extensive research into the scattered records of the Dark Age of Technology, where fragmentary references to the Millennia Gate appeared in heavily encrypted files that had survived the chaos of the Age of Strife. These documents, written in archaic technical languages that few humans could still comprehend, described experiments in dimensional manipulation that had gone catastrophically wrong, forcing the evacuation of research facilities and the implementation of containment protocols that were designed to prevent unauthorized access to the gateway. The Emperor's vast knowledge of ancient human civilization allowed him to piece together the scattered clues and recognize the significance of what lay hidden on Millennia. The journey to Millennia required careful preparation and absolute secrecy, as the Emperor understood that knowledge of the gateway's existence would attract the attention of forces that he was not yet prepared to confront directly. He traveled alone, using a modified spacecraft that incorporated stealth technologies derived from his study of Zeno's engineering principles. The vessel's design eliminated most electromagnetic signatures while incorporating psychic shielding that would prevent detection by entities that might be monitoring the warp for signs of approaching threats. The Emperor's personal involvement in every aspect of the mission's planning reflected his understanding that any mistake could result in consequences that would affect the entire future of human civilization. The surface of Millennia showed few signs of its dark history when the Emperor arrived. The planet's human population had dwindled to a few scattered settlements following the collapse of the Dark Age infrastructure, and the survivors had developed a primitive agricultural society that bore little resemblance to the advanced civilization that had once flourished there. The colonists had passed down fragmentary warnings about certain regions of the planet that were to be avoided at all costs, but the specific nature of these prohibitions had been lost over the generations. The Emperor's investigation of these forbidden zones led him to the sealed entrance of the ancient research facility, where the gateway had been contained. The facility itself was a marvel of Dark Age engineering, constructed using techniques that combined conventional architecture with psychic manipulation to create structures that existed partially outside normal space-time. The Emperor's examination of the containment systems revealed the sophisticated understanding of dimensional physics that the original researchers had possessed, along with their growing recognition of the dangers they had unleashed. The facility's design incorporated multiple layers of physical and psychic barriers, each designed to prevent the gateway from being accessed by unauthorized personnel or influenced by entities from beyond the barrier between realities. The Emperor's approach to the sealed gateway required him to carefully dismantle the containment systems while maintaining enough control to prevent the uncontrolled release of the forces contained within. The process took several days of continuous work, as each layer of protection had to be analyzed and neutralized without triggering the facility's automatic destruction sequences. The Emperor's vast psychic abilities allowed him to perceive the dimensional distortions created by the gateway, while his technical knowledge provided the understanding necessary to safely manipulate the containment mechanisms. The gateway itself defied conventional description, existing as a stable rift in reality that connected the material universe directly to the realm of chaos. Unlike the temporary portals that occasionally opened during warp storms or demonic incursions, this gateway had been artificially stabilized using principles of dimensional engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, even with Dark Age technology. The Emperor's examination of the gateway's structure revealed the incredible risks that the original researchers had taken in their attempts to establish direct communication with the entities that ruled the Imperium. The Emperor's decision to pass through the gateway and enter the realm of chaos directly represented perhaps the greatest calculated risk in his long existence. He understood that the entities that ruled the warp were not merely powerful, but represented fundamental forces of corruption and destruction that had been growing stronger since the earliest days of human civilization. However, his analysis of the Primarch project had revealed that the creation of beings with the capabilities he envisioned would require access to forces that existed beyond the material realm, power that could only be obtained through direct negotiation with the Chaos Gods themselves. The realm beyond the gateway bore little resemblance to the material universe that the Emperor had known for millennia. Here, the normal laws of physics held no sway, and reality itself was shaped by the will and emotions of the entities that inhabited this dimension. The Emperor found himself in a landscape that constantly shifted and changed, reflecting the chaotic nature of the powers that ruled this realm. Massive structures that defied architectural logic rose and fell according to the whims of their creators, while the very air itself seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. The Emperor's first encounter with the Chaos Gods occurred in a vast amphitheater that materialized around him as he progressed deeper into their realm. The four great powers of chaos appeared not as the crude demonic forms that they typically used when manifesting in the material universe, but as abstract representations of the fundamental forces they embodied. Khorne appeared as a towering figure of brass and blood, his form radiating the pure essence of violence and conquest. Tzeentch manifested as a constantly shifting pattern of light and shadow, his appearance changing with each moment as he contemplated infinite possibilities and schemes. Nurgle's presence was felt as an overwhelming sense of decay and renewal, his form incorporating elements of both death and rebirth in a cycle that had no beginning or end. Slaanesh, though not yet fully formed, was represented by a growing sense of excess and perfection that promised both ultimate pleasure and complete damnation. The negotiations that followed were conducted on a level that transcended normal communication, involving the direct exchange of concepts and intentions between beings of immense psychic power. The Emperor's proposal was audacious in its scope. He sought to gain access to the fundamental forces of creation and destruction that the Chaos Gods commanded, power that would allow him to create beings that could serve as humanity's champions in the coming struggle for galactic dominance. In exchange, he offered something that the Chaos Gods valued even more than worship or submission: the promise of conflict on a scale that would feed their hunger for millennia to come. The Emperor's understanding of the Chaos Gods' nature allowed him to frame his proposal in terms that would appeal to their fundamental drives and desires. He explained that his plan to reunite humanity and launch a Great Crusade across the galaxy would create warfare and strife on an unprecedented scale, generating the emotions and conflicts that served as sustenance for the Chaos powers. The Emperor presented himself not as a supplicant seeking divine favor, but as a partner offering a mutually beneficial arrangement that would serve the interests of both parties. The specific terms of the bargain were complex and multi-layered, involving not just the immediate transfer of power, but also long-term obligations and restrictions that would shape the Emperor's future actions. The Chaos Gods agreed to provide the knowledge and energy necessary for the Primarchs' creation, including access to the fundamental forces that governed life, death, and transformation. This power would allow the Emperor to create beings that transcended normal biological limitations, possessing capabilities that approached his own, while serving as focal points for human loyalty and inspiration. However, the Chaos Gods agreement came with prices that extended far beyond the immediate cost of the power being transferred. The Emperor would be required to accept certain limitations on his ability to directly oppose chaos influence, while the Primarchs themselves would carry within them the seeds of potential corruption that could be activated under the right circumstances. The Chaos Gods also secured the right to influence the development of the Primarchs in subtle ways, ensuring that their creations would not be completely immune to the temptations and pressures that served chaos interests. The Emperor's acceptance of these terms reflected his confidence in his ability to manage and control the influences that the Chaos Gods would attempt to exert over his creations. He believed that his superior knowledge of human psychology and his direct involvement in the Primarch's development would allow him to counteract any corrupting influences while still benefiting from the power that the bargain provided. The Emperor's millennia of experience in dealing with chaos entities had taught him that their influence could be resisted through proper preparation and constant vigilance, and he was convinced that the advantages gained from the bargain would outweigh the risks involved. The transfer of power that concluded the negotiations was unlike anything the Emperor had previously experienced. The Chaos Gods channeled their essence directly into his being, granting him access to forces that existed at the very foundation of reality itself. The Emperor felt his understanding of genetics, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of life expand exponentially as knowledge that had been accumulated over millions of years was compressed into his mind. The power flowing through him was intoxicating and dangerous, requiring tremendous willpower to control and direct toward his intended purposes. The Emperor's return to the material universe through the Millennium Gateway marked the beginning of the most intensive phase of his preparations for the Primarch project. The knowledge and power he had gained from the Chaos Gods provided him with the capabilities necessary to create beings that would serve as the foundation for his plans to reunite humanity, but the process would require decades of careful work to implement safely. The Emperor's understanding of the risks involved in his bargain with chaos had been enhanced by his direct experience with their realm, and he began developing additional safeguards and contingencies to protect his creations from the influences that would inevitably attempt to corrupt them. The implications of the Millennium revelation extended far beyond the immediate creation of the Primarchs to encompass fundamental questions about the Emperor's relationship with chaos and his ultimate goals for humanity. The bargain had established a complex web of obligations and influences that would shape the development of the Imperium for millennia to come, creating vulnerabilities that the Chaos Gods would eventually exploit to devastating effect. The Emperor's decision to accept these risks in pursuit of his vision for humanity's future demonstrated both his tremendous ambition and his willingness to make sacrifices that would have consequences far beyond his ability to predict or control. The knowledge of the Millennium Gateway's existence and the Emperor's journey through it would remain one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Imperium, known only to the Emperor himself and carefully hidden from even his most trusted advisors. The potential for this information to be discovered and misused by enemies of the Imperium represented a constant threat that would influence the Emperor's strategic planning throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. The Emperor's efforts to secure and monitor the gateway would require the deployment of significant resources and the establishment of elaborate cover stories to prevent unauthorized access to the site. The Emperor's enhanced understanding of chaos corruption, gained through his direct experience in their realm, would prove invaluable in his efforts to protect the Primarchs and other Imperial forces from similar influences. He developed new techniques for detecting and countering chaos corruption that drew upon his first-hand knowledge of how such influences operated and spread. These methods would be incorporated into the training programs for Imperial forces and the security protocols that governed access to sensitive information and technologies. However, the Emperor's bargain with the Chaos Gods had also created new vulnerabilities that would eventually be exploited by his enemies. The Chaos Powers had gained insights into the Emperor's methods and motivations that would allow them to develop more effective strategies for opposing his plans. The influence they had secured over the Primarchs would provide them with opportunities to corrupt and turn his greatest creations against him, while the knowledge of the Millennia Gateway would eventually lead to its rediscovery by forces seeking to use its power for their own purposes. The revelation of the Emperor's journey to Millennia would eventually reach Horus during his own pilgrimage to the world, providing the War Master with crucial insights into the source of his father's power and the nature of the bargain that had made the Primarchs possible. Horus's discovery of the Gateway and his decision to pass through it himself would mark a turning point in the heresy, as the War Master gained access to the same chaos powers that had enhanced the Emperor, while fully embracing the corruption that his father had sought to resist. The knowledge gained from Millennia would transform Horus from a rebellious son into a true champion of chaos, possessed of power that could rival the Emperor's own, while serving masters whose ultimate goal was the destruction of everything the Emperor had sought to build. The Emperor's attempts to prevent the rediscovery of Millennia had included the establishment of monitoring stations and the deployment of specialized forces to guard the approaches to the world. However, these measures would prove insufficient to prevent Horus from reaching the Gateway, as the War Master's knowledge of Imperial security procedures and his access to detailed intelligence about the Emperor's activities would allow him to circumvent the protective measures that had been put in place. The failure of these safeguards would demonstrate the fundamental difficulty of containing knowledge that had such profound implications for the balance of power in the galaxy. The Emperor's transformation from the immortal wanderer who had guided humanity through millennia of darkness to the god-like ruler of a galaxy-spanning empire represents one of the most profound metamorphoses in human history. The being who had once walked among primitive tribes as a wise elder or mysterious benefactor had evolved into something far more complex and terrible, a figure whose very presence could inspire fanatical devotion or paralyzing terror, depending on the observer's perspective and circumstances. This transformation was not merely a change in political status or military authority, but a fundamental alteration in the Emperor's relationship with humanity itself, as he moved from the role of hidden guardian to that of absolute sovereign. The Emperor's emergence during the Unification Wars had required him to abandon the subtle manipulations and indirect influences that had characterized his previous interventions in human affairs. The scale of the crises facing Terra and the urgent need to prevent humanity's extinction had forced him to reveal capabilities that he had kept hidden for millennia. The Thunder Warriors who followed him from the Himalayan peaks witnessed displays of power that defied rational explanation, as their master wielded psychic abilities that could shatter enemy formations and reshape the battlefield itself. These demonstrations established the Emperor not merely as a superior military commander, but as a being whose nature transcended normal human limitations. The creation of the Primarchs had marked a crucial turning point in the Emperor's evolution from wanderer to ruler. The genetic engineering project that produced his superhuman sons required him to delve deeper into the mysteries of life and consciousness than any previous endeavor, pushing his understanding of biology and psychic manipulation to unprecedented levels. The bargain with the Chaos Gods on Millennia had provided him with access to forces that existed at the very foundation of reality, but it had also bound him to obligations and influences that would shape his future actions in ways he could not fully anticipate. The Emperor's willingness to accept these risks in pursuit of his vision for humanity demonstrated both his tremendous ambition and his growing distance from the species he sought to protect. The Great Crusade had transformed the Emperor from a hidden manipulator into the visible leader of humanity's greatest military endeavor. His personal involvement in the early expeditions established him as not merely the architect of human reunification, but as its primary champion and symbol. The worlds liberated by Imperial forces witnessed the Emperor's power firsthand, as he led assaults against alien strongholds and shattered the defenses of civilizations that had oppressed human populations for generations. These victories created a legend that spread throughout the galaxy, establishing the Emperor as humanity's savior and the embodiment of their species' potential for greatness. However, the Emperor's methods of achieving unity often revealed the darker aspects of his nature. The systematic elimination of alien species, regardless of their apparent benevolence or willingness to coexist peacefully with humanity, demonstrated a ruthlessness that extended beyond military necessity to encompass fundamental questions about the value of non-human life. The Emperor's justification for these policies drew upon his millennia of experience with alien civilizations and his understanding of the threats they posed to human survival, but the implementation of these directives required a level of callousness that seemed to contradict his role as humanity's protector. The suppression of religion through the imperial truth represented another aspect of the Emperor's transformation from guide to tyrant. The systematic destruction of spiritual beliefs that had provided meaning and comfort to human populations for millennia required the deployment of propaganda techniques and enforcement mechanisms that bore disturbing resemblances to the authoritarian systems he had opposed throughout history. The Emperor's agents worked tirelessly to identify and eliminate religious leaders, destroy sacred texts and artifacts, and replace traditional ceremonies with secular celebrations that honored imperial authority rather than divine power. The Emperor's withdrawal from active leadership of the Great Crusade to focus on the Webway project revealed the extent to which his priorities had shifted from immediate military concerns to long-term strategic objectives. The massive construction effort beneath the imperial palace consumed enormous resources and required his constant personal attention, forcing him to delegate increasing responsibility to the Primarchs and other imperial commanders. This transition marked a fundamental change in the Emperor's relationship with his forces, as he moved from direct leadership to remote oversight of operations he had previously managed personally. The fundamental contradictions in the Emperor's nature became increasingly apparent as his empire expanded and his authority grew more absolute. The being who had spent millennia protecting humanity from the predations of chaos had made bargains with the very entities he opposed, accepting their influence over his greatest creations in exchange for the power needed to realize his vision. The champion of human enlightenment had established an authoritarian regime that suppressed free thought and independent inquiry in favor of rigid adherence to imperial doctrine. The protector of human civilization had implemented policies that resulted in the deaths of billions of his own species in pursuit of unity and compliance. These contradictions were not merely the result of pragmatic compromises forced by difficult circumstances, but reflected deeper tensions within the Emperor's own psyche and understanding of his role. The collective consciousness that had emerged from the great sacrifice of the ancient Shamans contained within it the accumulated experiences and perspectives of thousands of individuals, creating a complex mental landscape that could support seemingly incompatible viewpoints and motivations. The Emperor's ability to simultaneously embody the roles of savior and destroyer, rationalist and mystic, protector and tyrant, stemmed from this fundamental multiplicity of his nature. The Emperor's relationship with the concept of divinity represented one of the most complex aspects of his character and the source of profound theological debates that would persist throughout imperial history. His rejection of worship and his insistence on the imperial truth's materialist philosophy stood in stark contrast to the reverence and devotion that his presence inspired among his followers. The Emperor's demonstrations of power that defied scientific explanation, his apparent immortality, and his ability to perform what could only be described as miracles created a cognitive dissonance that many humans resolved by treating him as a god, despite his explicit rejection of such veneration. The growth of the imperial cult represented a direct challenge to the Emperor's authority and his vision for humanity's future. The religious movement that began among the populations of conquered worlds gradually spread throughout the Imperium, creating an alternative source of meaning and purpose that competed with the secular ideology of the imperial truth. The cult's adherents interpreted the emperor's rejection of worship as a test of their faith rather than a genuine prohibition, developing elaborate theological frameworks that explained his apparent reluctance to accept divine honors as evidence of his transcendent nature. The emperor's response to the growth of the imperial cult revealed the limitations of his understanding of human psychology and the unintended consequences of his own actions. His attempts to suppress religious devotion through rational argument and administrative decree proved ineffective against the emotional and spiritual needs that drove his followers to seek meaning beyond the material world. The emperor's very presence and the miraculous nature of his achievements provided evidence for his divine nature that no amount of logical argumentation could counter, creating a situation where his efforts to prevent worship actually strengthened the theological arguments of his devotees. The theological debates surrounding the emperor's nature and status would continue throughout imperial history, generating schisms and conflicts that would shape the development of human civilization for millennia. The question of whether the emperor was truly divine or merely an extremely powerful human being touched upon fundamental issues of faith, reason, and the nature of reality itself. These debates were not merely academic exercises, but had profound practical implications for imperial policy, military strategy, and the daily lives of billions of human beings across the galaxy. The emperor's choices and actions during the Great Crusade established patterns and precedents that would influence the development of the Imperium long after his own active involvement in its governance had ended. The authoritarian structure he created to manage the vast territories under imperial control became the foundation for a bureaucratic system that would persist for 10,000 years, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining the essential characteristics of centralized authority and rigid hierarchy. The military doctrines developed during the Crusade would shape imperial strategy for millennia, while the technological innovations produced by the alliance with Mars would provide the foundation for the Imperium's industrial and military capabilities. The Emperor's relationship with the Primarchs represented both his greatest triumph and his most catastrophic failure. The superhuman beings he had created to serve as humanity's champions possessed capabilities that exceeded even his ambitious expectations, demonstrating leadership, tactical genius, and inspirational qualities that made them invaluable assets in the campaign to reunite the galaxy. However, the same qualities that made the Primarchs effective military commanders also made them potential threats to imperial unity, as their independence and charisma created alternative sources of loyalty that could compete with devotion to the Emperor himself. The Horus Heresy represented the ultimate consequence of the contradictions and tensions that had been building within the Imperium since its founding. The rebellion of the War Master and his followers was not merely a military revolt, but a fundamental challenge to the Emperor's vision for humanity's future and the methods he had employed to achieve it. The civil war that engulfed the galaxy revealed the extent to which the Emperor's authoritarian rule had created resentment and opposition even among his most trusted servants, while the involvement of chaos forces demonstrated the consequences of his bargains with the dark powers of the warp. The Emperor's final confrontation with Horus aboard the War Master's flagship represented the culmination of all the choices and compromises that had shaped his existence since the Great Sacrifice. The battle between father and son was not merely a physical conflict, but a struggle between competing visions of humanity's future and the prices that were acceptable to pay for survival and unity. The Emperor's victory came at the cost of his own physical existence, as the injuries inflicted by Horus required his permanent entombment upon the Golden Throne to prevent his death and the collapse of the imperial infrastructure that depended upon his psychic power. The Emperor's transformation into the corpse god of the Imperium represented the final stage of his evolution from wanderer to ruler. Bound to the Golden Throne by life support systems and psychic apparatus, he became a living relic whose continued existence was essential for the survival of human civilization, but whose ability to actively guide its development was severely limited. The Emperor's consciousness, trapped within his failing body, could no longer provide the direct leadership that had characterized his rule during the Great Crusade, forcing the Imperium to develop new institutions and traditions to maintain unity and purpose in his absence. The irony of the Emperor's ultimate fate was that his rejection of worship and his insistence on rational, secular governance had ultimately led to his transformation into the central figure of the largest religious movement in human history. The imperial cult that he had opposed during his active reign became the dominant force in imperial society, providing the ideological framework that held the Imperium together during its darkest hours. The Emperor's image was transformed from that of a rational leader and military commander into that of a divine protector whose suffering on the Golden Throne served as both inspiration and warning to his followers. The lasting impact of the Emperor's legacy on the fate of humanity cannot be overstated. His vision of a united human species dominating the galaxy had been achieved, but at costs that he had not fully anticipated and through methods that contradicted many of his original principles. The Imperium that survived his physical death was simultaneously the fulfillment of his greatest ambitions and a grotesque distortion of his intended creation. The authoritarian structure he had established to manage the Great Crusade had evolved into a rigid theocracy that suppressed the very rational inquiry and technological innovation that he had sought to promote. The Emperor's influence on human civilization extended far beyond the political and military institutions he had created. His genetic legacy lived on in the Space Marine chapters that continued to serve as the Imperium's primary military force, while his psychic abilities provided the foundation for the astronomicon that guided Imperial ships through the warp. The technologies developed during his reign, particularly those created through the alliance with Mars, remained the basis for Imperial manufacturing and military equipment 10,000 years after his entombment. The Emperor's impact on human culture was equally profound, as his image and teachings became central to the belief systems that shaped the daily lives of trillions of Imperial citizens. The Emperor's story represents both the ultimate triumph and the ultimate tragedy of human ambition. His success in uniting humanity and establishing a galactic empire demonstrated the species' potential for greatness and their ability to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles through determination, sacrifice, and visionary leadership. However, the costs of this achievement and the methods required to maintain it revealed the darker aspects of human nature and the prices that civilizations must pay for survival in a hostile universe. The Emperor's legacy serves as both inspiration and warning, demonstrating the heights that humanity can reach while illustrating the dangers of unchecked power and the unintended consequences of even the most well-intentioned actions. The master of mankind's transformation from immortal wanderer to God Emperor represents one of the most complex and consequential character arcs in human history. His journey from the hidden guardian of primitive tribes to the absolute ruler of a galaxy-spanning empire illustrates the fundamental tensions between individual freedom and collective survival, between rational governance and emotional meaning, between the pursuit of perfection and the acceptance of human limitations. The Emperor's legacy continues to shape the Imperium 10 millennia after his entombment, serving as the foundation for a civilization that embodies both humanity's greatest achievements and its most troubling failures. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Emperor's vision of human unity and dominance endures, but at costs that even his vast intellect and millennia of experience could not have fully foreseen or prevented.